At a lavish family dinner, I screamed that my contractions had started. My own mother snapped at me to call a taxi and stop ruining the aesthetic for her wealthy friends. Not a single person in my own bloodline lifted a finger to help as I dragged myself out the back door in agonizing pain. 10 days later, my parents showed up at my doorstep with bright fake smiles, announcing they were there to meet their new grandchild. I looked them dead in the eye and replied that they had abandoned my baby and me to die in an alleyway that night. Before my mother could even formulate another vicious insult, the towering man standing in the shadows behind me stepped forward and pulled the door wide open. My mother took one look at his face and all the color completely drained from hers. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a senior forensic auditor, I built a successful life entirely on my own, but I made the mistake of maintaining occasional contact with the people who shared my DNA. Growing up, my parents, Beatrice and Winston, treated my very existence as a burden. They were prominent members of our local church board, obsessed with status, appearances, and wealth. My younger sister Chloe was their golden child, praised for her straightened hair, her lighter skin, and her compliance with their shallow values. I was the dark-skinned outsider who wore my natural coils with pride, skipped the beauty pageants, and focused on my education. They drained my college fund to buy Chloe a luxury car, leaving me to work 3 jobs to survive. But nothing they did in my childhood could have prepared me for the ultimate betrayal they would inflict on me during the most vulnerable moment of my life. It all happened on a freezing Friday night. I was exactly 34 weeks pregnant. Chloe and her husband Jamal were hosting a massive, incredibly expensive gala to celebrate the first anniversary of Jamal's luxury auto showroom. The event was essentially a massive networking party designed to secure new investments for his business. My parents had begged me to come, not because they wanted my company, but because the church elders and potential investors were going to be there, and my absence would spark rumors of family dysfunction. I stood in the corner of the sprawling, brilliantly lit showroom trying to stay out of the way. I was wearing a simple, elegant maternity dress, quietly sipping sparkling water while jazz music echoed off the imported marble floors. Across the room, Beatrice and Winston were holding court with wealthy donors, laughing loudly and pointing proudly at Chloe, who was draped in a sequined designer gown. Jamal was glad, handing businessmen projecting the image of a wildly successful entrepreneur. Then, without any warning, a sharp, tearing pain ripped through my lower abdomen. It was a pain so intense and unnatural that it stole the breath straight from my lungs. I gasped, instinctively clutching my swollen stomach as my knees buckled. The crystal glass slipped from my trembling fingers and shattered violently against the marble floor. The loud, echoing crack cut straight through the music and the chatter. The entire room went dead silent. Everyone turned to look at me. A warm rush of fluid soaked through my dress and pooled on the pristine floor, mixed with a terrifying amount of bright red blood. My water had broken and something was terribly, terribly wrong. I looked up, searching the crowd for my mother, my father, anyone who could help me. Beatrice locked eyes with me. But there was no maternal panic in her gaze, no fear for her daughter or her unborn grandchild. There was only absolute, unadulterated fury. She slammed her champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray and stormed across the room. Her expensive heels clicked sharply against the floor. Before I could even open my mouth to ask for help, her manicured fingers dug into my upper arm like eagle talons. Her nails pierced my skin as she forcefully yanked me upward. I cried out in pain, but she ignored my voice. She dragged me roughly away from the crowd, pushing me through a set of heavy wooden doors that led into the catering kitchen. "Are you out of your mind?" Beatrice hissed, shoving me against a stainless steel prep counter. I collapsed against the metal, gasping for air as another brutal contraction tore through my body. "You could not wait 1 more hour." Chloe was about to give her speech to the investors. "You are making a scene on purpose." I looked at her in pure disbelief, tears streaming down my face. "Mom, the baby is coming." I choked out, my voice breaking. "I need an ambulance right now. There is blood. Please, Mom, please." The heavy kitchen doors swung open again, and my father Winston marched in. He did not look at my terrified face or the blood staining my shoes. He immediately looked back over his shoulder to make sure none of his wealthy church friends had followed us into the kitchen. "Keep your voice down," Winston ordered, his tone laced with pure ice. "Jamal is about to close a massive funding deal tonight. We cannot have an ambulance flashing its sirens outside the showroom. It will look like a crime scene and completely ruin the aesthetic of the entire evening." I sobbed, clutching my stomach, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over me. "I am bleeding to death," I pleaded, begging the men and women who gave me life to show a single ounce of mercy. "Please call 911. Before either of them could answer, Chloe pushed her way into the kitchen. She carefully gathered the hem of her expensive gown so it would not touch the wet floor, looking at me with pure disgust. "I knew we should not have invited her," Chloe snapped, turning her anger on our parents. "Look at her. She refused to get her hair pressed like you asked. She showed up looking completely unkempt in her natural hair, and now she is purposely throwing a medical fit to steal my spotlight. She has always been jealous of my success." Right behind her, Jamal stepped into the kitchen, checking his expensive watch with an irritated sigh. "What is going on in here?" Jamal demanded. "I can hear her groaning all the way from the champagne fountain. Beatrice, you need to get her out of here right now. The investors are asking uncomfortable questions, and I cannot afford any distractions tonight." Not a single person in my own bloodline lifted a finger to support my weight. Winston reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his money clip, and peeled off a single wrinkled $50 bill. He shoved the crumpled paper into my trembling, sweaty palm. "There is a back exit through the loading dock," Winston said, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth or human empathy. "Walk out through the alley. Do not let anyone see you. Call a taxi and go to the county hospital. Do not cause a scene out front. And do not expect us to abandon this event just because you could not handle your pregnancy properly." I stared at the $50 bill in my hand. The absolute cruelty of their words echoed in my mind, drowning out the physical agony tearing through my body. They were literally watching me bleed out onto a commercial kitchen floor, and their only concern was preserving the illusion of their perfect, wealthy lives. With shaking hands, I pushed myself away from the counter. I did not say another word to them. I knew that if I stayed in that kitchen begging for their love, my baby, and I would both die waiting for a compassion they did not possess. I stumbled toward the heavy metal door that led to the back alley. The cold night air hit my face like a physical blow as I pushed the door open. Freezing rain was pouring from the sky, soaking through my thin dress in seconds. I leaned against the rough brick wall of the alleyway, every breath feeling like shattered glass in my lungs. My vision was blurring, dark spots dancing at the edges of my sight as I fumbled with my phone to order a ride. The pain was blinding, wrapping around my spine and pulling me toward the wet pavement. When a stranger's car finally pulled into the dark alley, I practically crawled into the back seat, leaving a trail of blood in the rain. The driver looked back at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes widening in panic as he saw my condition. I could not even speak to tell him where to go, but he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, rushing me toward the nearest emergency room. I clutched my stomach, gripping that pathetic $50 bill entirely alone in the world. As the car sped away into the dark city, I closed my eyes, completely unaware that this horrific night was only the beginning of a massive reckoning that would soon destroy my family's entire fraudulent empire. The freezing rain lashed against the windows of the stranger's car as we sped away from the luxury auto showroom. In the back seat, I was fighting a losing battle against the darkness creeping into my vision. Every time the car hit a pothole, a fresh wave of agony radiated from my lower abdomen, pulling a strangled cry from my throat. I pressed my hands against my stomach, feeling the terrifying stillness where my baby should have been moving. The driver, an older black man with kind eyes, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. His face was a mask of pure terror. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were turning white. "Miss, you are bleeding everywhere," the driver said, his voice trembling with panic. "Should I call your family? Do you want me to call your husband or your parents? I can put them on speakerphone right now. Just give me a number." I leaned my head back against the cold leather seat and let out a breathless, broken laugh. The sound was so entirely devoid of hope that the driver flinched. "Call them. I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain and the roaring engine. My parents drained my $50,000 college fund just to buy my sister her first Mercedes so she could look the part for her sorority. Leaving me to bleed out in a taxi is just another Tuesday for them. The driver stared at me through the mirror, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the sheer cruelty of what I had just said. He did not ask any more questions. He just turned his hazard lights on, laid on the horn, and ran 2 red lights to get me to the county hospital faster. When we finally screeched to a halt outside the emergency room doors, I could not even feel my legs. The driver leaped out of the car, sprinting through the automatic sliding doors while screaming for help. Within seconds, a team of nurses and orderlies rushed out into the freezing rain with a gurney. They pulled me from the blood-soaked back seat, lifting my limp body onto the stretcher. The bright, sterile lights of the emergency room blinded me as they wheeled me through the sliding doors. The chaotic noise of the hospital blurred together into a terrifying symphony of medical alarms and shouting voices. "We need a trauma surgeon right now," a nurse yelled as she ran alongside my gurney, pressing a thick wad of gauze against me in a desperate attempt to slow the hemorrhaging. Patient is 34 weeks pregnant. Massive placental abruption. Her blood pressure is plummeting. We are losing her. I stared up at the ceiling tiles passing by in a dizzying blur. The pain had shifted from sharp agony to a deep, horrifying numbness. My body was going into shock. Another nurse leaned over me, shining a bright penlight into my eyes. She grabbed my hand, her grip urgent and tight. "Honey, stay with me," she commanded. "You need to stay awake. We need an emergency contact right now. Who do we call? We need a family member to sign the consent forms for the emergency surgery." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I could not give them Calvin's name. Calvin Sterling was my secret fiancé, the billionaire CEO of Sterling Holdings and the father of my child. I had deliberately kept him hidden from my family because I knew exactly what Beatrice and Winston would do if they found out I was marrying a man with that level of wealth and power. They would harass him, extort him, and demand investments for Jamal's shady business ventures. Calvin was currently on a private jet returning from a business trip in London. He had no idea I was dying on an operating table, as the nurses frantically prepped me for emergency surgery, cutting away my ruined maternity dress and attaching cold monitor pads to my chest. A harsh buzzing sound cut through the medical chaos. It was my cell phone. The device was sitting on the stainless steel medical tray beside my bed, the screen glowing brightly in the dim trauma bay. The notification popped up large and clear. It was a message from the family group chat. A nurse, thinking it was someone calling to check on my medical status, reached over and tapped the screen to read the message out loud. But as her eyes scanned the text, her expression dropped. She looked at me, her face pale with absolute disgust. I turned my head weakly, forcing my heavy eyelids open just enough to read the glowing words on the screen. It was a text from my father, Winston. The message read, "Make sure you do not list us as financial guarantors on your hospital intake forms. Jamal's business is at a critical stage. We cannot have your medical debt affecting our credit score. You chose to leave the gala and cause a scene, so you are responsible for whatever bill they hand you. Do not call your mother tonight, she is exhausted from hosting." The digital slap hit harder than any physical blow ever could. I was lying on an operating table bleeding out, and the last words my father had for me were instructions on how to protect his credit score. He did not ask if the baby was alive. He did not ask if I was surviving. He only cared about the money. A profound, suffocating darkness began to wash over me. The betrayal severed the final tether holding me to consciousness. I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall freely down my temples, mixing with the sterile smell of iodine and panic. I was done. I was completely and utterly done fighting for a place in a family that viewed my death as a financial inconvenience. "Heart rate is dropping," one of the doctors shouted, his voice sounding distant and muffled as the edges of my world began to fade into black. "We cannot wait any longer. We have to get the baby out now. Put her under." A clear plastic mask was pressed firmly over my nose and mouth. A sweet chemical smell flooded my lungs. I took a shallow breath, feeling the heavy weight of the anesthesia pulling me down into the abyss. The rhythmic, steady beeping of the heart monitor attached to my chest began to slow down, the sound stretching out into long, terrifying pauses. I was dying. I could feel my soul detaching from my body, drifting away from the pain and the heartbreak. But just as the monitor began to emit a long, continuous tone, signaling that my heart was failing, a massive commotion erupted outside the trauma bay. The heavy double doors of the emergency room did not just open, they burst apart violently. A man's voice, commanding, furious, and radiating absolute authority, echoed through the sterile hallway, freezing every single medical professional in their tracks. "Get away from her," the voice roared. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms and dictated the flow of millions of dollars. It was a voice that did not ask for permission. Calvin Sterling stepped into the trauma bay, his bespoke designer suit drenched in freezing rain, his chest heaving as he took in the horrific scene. He had landed his private jet early, seen my missed calls, and tracked my phone's location directly to the county hospital. Behind him stood a team of 3 elite private trauma surgeons he had personally flown in. Calvin walked straight past the stunned hospital staff and grabbed my cold, limp hand. He looked down at my face, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He glanced at the phone resting on the medical tray, reading the cruel, heartless text message my father had sent just moments before. Calvin's eyes, normally warm and full of love, turned to pure, unadulterated ice. He picked up the phone, locked the screen, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He looked back down at me as the darkness finally consumed my vision. I could not speak, but I heard his final words clearly before the anesthesia took me entirely. "I am here," Naomi Calvin whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of grief and absolute rage. "You and the baby are going to live. And when you wake up, we are going to burn their entire world to the ground." The commanding voice faded into a distant echo as the heavy anesthesia pulled me completely under. I drifted back into consciousness, surrounded by a deep, absolute silence. The freezing draft that had seeped into my bones was replaced by a heavy, soft blanket. I slowly opened my eyes. I was no longer in a chaotic trauma bay. Instead, I found myself lying in a private recovery suite. Sunlight poured through large windows, illuminating mahogany wall panels and expensive artwork. The scent of fresh orchids filled the air. I tried to shift my weight, wincing as a dull ache pulled at my abdomen, but before I could process the pain, a large, warm hand enveloped mine. I turned my head to the side. Sitting in a leather armchair beside my bed, looking exhausted but fiercely alert, was Calvin Sterling. Calvin was not just my secret fiancé. He was the billionaire chief executive officer of Sterling Holdings, the most powerful private equity firm in the region. He was also the father of my child. I had spent the last 2 years carefully keeping Calvin a complete secret from my family. I knew exactly what Beatrice and Winston would do if they discovered I was engaged to a man with his level of limitless wealth. They would have suffocated him with endless demands and manipulative schemes. I wanted to protect Calvin from the toxic parasites that shared my bloodline, so I played the quiet auditor role. Calvin pressed my hand to his lips. He looked at me with eyes so full of love and terrifying anger that it made my breath catch in my throat. He told me I had been asleep for 2 full days. The trauma team he brought in had performed an emergency surgery, saving both my life and our beautiful baby girl. I let out a massive sob of pure relief, gripping his hand very tightly. But then I saw the hard, unforgiving line of his jaw. Calvin reached into his pocket and pulled out my cell phone. He told me he had kept it charged for the past 48 hours, waiting to see if a single person from my family would call to ask if I survived the night. He unlocked the screen and handed the phone to me. My inbox was completely empty. Not a single missed call from Winston. Not one text message from Beatrice. Chloe had not bothered to ask if her niece was alive or if I was dead. Jamal had not inquired if I bled to death in the alleyway behind his business. Instead, Calvin opened a social media app and clicked on Chloe's public profile. Her page was flooded with dozens of high-quality, professionally edited photos from the gala. There she was standing in her silver sequined gown, holding a crystal glass of mimosa, throwing her head back in fake laughter. The captions made me feel physically sick to my stomach. She bragged about hosting the most elite networking event of the season. She posted long, rambling paragraphs praising Jamal's booming empire and thanking God. She thanked God for blessing their incredibly successful business. In the background of one photo, I could clearly see the exact spot on the marble floor where my water had broken, now polished and shining, as if nothing had ever happened. They had literally washed my blood away and kept right on partying. I stared at the images of my mother and father smiling for the camera, posing with wealthy church elders, while I was fighting for my life on a cold operating table. A fresh wave of hot tears spilled down my cheeks, but they were not sorrowful. They were tears of pure, blinding rage. Every single ounce of loyalty I ever felt toward my family evaporated in that instant. I handed the phone back to Calvin. He tossed it onto the bedside table and stood up, running a hand through his dark hair. Calvin paced across the luxury suite, his voice vibrating with a dangerous intensity. He told me he was going to destroy them today. He planned to buy the commercial property where Jamal leased his showroom and evict him immediately. He wanted to call his legal team to file criminal negligence charges against them. He swore he would strip them of every single asset they owned and make sure they spent the rest of their pathetic lives rotting in a jail cell for leaving me to die. He was ready to unleash the full, terrifying weight of his billionaire empire against them before lunchtime. I reached out, grabbing his wrist to stop his pacing. I pulled him back down to the edge of the bed and looked him dead in the eye. I told him no. I did not want him to crush them with a billionaire's brute force. That was easy. That would be too quick and too easy. They would just play the victim card, crying to their church congregation about how a wealthy, powerful man was targeting a humble, hard-working family. They would spin the narrative to make themselves look like martyrs. I told Calvin I wanted to tear them down from the inside out, using the very thing they valued more than my life: their fake wealth and their fraudulent reputation. I reminded Calvin of who I really was. I was not just a quiet woman who kept to herself. I was a senior forensic auditor. I was the senior forensic auditor at Sterling Holdings. For the past 4 years, I had built my career hunting down financial criminals and exposing massive corporate fraud. I dismantled illegal operations with ruthless precision. And for the past 3 weeks, completely off the record, I had been quietly looking into Jamal's so-called booming empire. I knew things about his business that not even Chloe or my parents knew. I had noticed strange irregularities in the way Jamal talked about his inventory and his cash flow during family dinners. I asked Calvin to hand me his secure tablet. He looked confused but reached into his leather briefcase and handed me the device. I sat up slightly, ignoring the dull pain in my stomach, and logged into the Sterling Holdings private server using my secure credentials. I told Calvin that Jamal was not the brilliant entrepreneur he pretended to be. His luxury auto showroom was a massive facade. I had already begun tracing the shell companies Jamal used to inflate his sales numbers. I explained that Jamal was drowning in millions of dollars of completely hidden debt. He was desperately using new investor money to pay old loans. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, wrapped in the shiny veneer of a successful dealership. I scrolled through the encrypted files on the tablet, bringing up the preliminary audit reports I had built during my lunch breaks at the office. I pointed to a specific chain of offshore transactions. I explained to Calvin that Chloe's entire designer lifestyle, the expensive cars, the custom gowns, the fancy country club memberships, were all funded by stolen money. Jamal was stealing from his own investors to keep them very wealthy now. And the absolute best part was that Winston and Beatrice had tied their own personal finances to Jamal's business. They were so desperate to look wealthy in front of the church elders that they had co-signed several of Jamal's commercial loans. They had tied the deed of their sprawling suburban home to a sinking ship. Calvin leaned over my shoulder, looking at the financial documents on the glowing screen. A slow, dark smile spread across his handsome face as he realized exactly what I was planning. It would be a complete and total financial annihilation. I would take their freedom, their status, and their pride. I told Calvin I needed full, unrestricted access to the highest level security clearance on the company servers. I needed him to authorize a formal deep dive forensic audit into Jamal's entire network using the full resources of Sterling Holdings. Calvin did not hesitate for a single second. He tapped the screen, granting me absolute administrative control over the firm's investigative division. A smiling neonatal nurse pushed a clear bassinet into the room. Inside, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, was my beautiful, healthy newborn daughter. I felt a surge of fierce, overwhelming protective instinct wash over me as Calvin lifted her carefully into my arms. I looked down at her perfect little face, silently promising that she would never, ever know the cold cruelty of the people who abandoned us. I held my daughter close to my chest with one arm, while my other hand rested firmly on the digital tablet displaying Jamal's fraudulent financial records. I looked at Calvin. My racing heart was steady, and my mind was completely clear. They just think I am a broke single mother. Let us see how much they try to extract from a corpse now. The heavy mahogany doors of the recovery suite swung shut, leaving Calvin and me alone in the quiet, sunlit room. I looked down at the digital tablet in my hand, the harsh numbers and incriminating financial records staring back at me. Jamal's entire fraudulent empire was mapped out right there on the screen, a fragile house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze to knock it down. I handed the tablet back to Calvin, a cold, focused determination settling over me. We were not going to strike today. If we attacked them now while I was still lying in a hospital bed, they would easily twist the narrative. They would claim I was emotionally unstable from the traumatic birth, and that Calvin was manipulating me. We needed them to feel completely safe. We needed them to believe they had won, so they would comfortably walk directly into our trap. I told Calvin my plan. We were going to go completely dark for 10 days. I instructed him not to contact them, not to send any legal warnings, and to let them continue believing that I was a broke, isolated single mother, struggling to survive in my tiny, rundown apartment. Calvin agreed, his dark eyes shining with a lethal, terrifying patience. He made a quick phone call to his elite security team, arranging for my immediate, completely private transfer from the county hospital to his sprawling, ultra-secure estate on the outskirts of the city. The next 10 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I rested, recovering my physical strength in the absolute luxury of Calvin's massive home, surrounded by top-tier medical professionals and a dedicated staff who doted on my every need. I spent hours holding my beautiful daughter, watching her sleep peacefully, entirely shielded from the toxic chaos of my biological family. Meanwhile, Chloe's social media was a constant, sickening stream of fabricated perfection. She posted daily updates bragging about Jamal's booming business, flaunting her expensive designer outfits, and loudly complaining about the stress of being a high society socialite. Not once did she or my parents attempt to reach out to see if I had survived the emergency surgery. They were completely and utterly unbothered by the fact that they had left me to die. On the morning of the 10th day, I decided it was time to cast the bait. I sat on the plush velvet sofa in Calvin's sunroom holding my phone. I carefully crafted a text message and sent it directly to my mother, Beatrice. The message was intentionally brief and pathetic. It read, "Mom, I am finally home from the hospital. The baby is here. I am struggling a bit and could really use some help. Are you free to come over?" I hit send and watched the screen. The message status quickly changed to read. I waited. 1 hour passed, then 5 hours, then a full 48 hours. The silence from Beatrice was deafening, but entirely predictable. She had absolutely no intention of helping her struggling daughter. But I knew the bait would eventually work, because I knew exactly what they wanted. 2 days later, my phone suddenly buzzed with an incoming text message. It was Beatrice. The tone of her message had completely shifted from cold silence to an aggressive fake cheerfulness. "Naomi, darling. We have been so incredibly busy with church events. Winston and I are coming over right now with Chloe and Jamal. We simply cannot wait another minute to see our beautiful, precious grandchild." I showed the text message to Calvin, who was sitting across from me reviewing corporate contracts. We both instantly knew they wanted something. My family never initiated contact unless they needed to extract money, demand a favor, or use me as a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish ambitions. They were coming because they had hit a wall in Jamal's fraudulent business, and they desperately needed my clean financial record to bail them out. They are on their way, I told Calvin, my voice steady and cold. They think I am back at my old apartment. Calvin immediately picked up his phone and called his head of security. He gave strict, precise instructions. When Winston's car arrived at the main gate of the estate, the security guards were to let them through without any hassle. However, they were instructed to act as if I was merely the hired help. They were to tell my family that I was just temporarily house-sitting this massive, luxurious property for an incredibly wealthy out-of-town client. My family would never in a million years believe that I actually lived here, and letting them think I was just a lowly servant would perfectly feed their massive, arrogant egos. Calvin then stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp, tailored dress shirt. He kissed my forehead gently, then retreated to the adjacent home office, intentionally leaving the heavy oak door cracked open just enough so he could hear and see everything that was about to unfold in the main living room. I settled onto the sofa holding my baby and waited for the parasites to arrive. 10 minutes later, the sharp, aggressive chime of the front doorbell echoed through the massive estate. I took a deep, calming breath, stood up, and walked slowly toward the grand foyer. I pulled the heavy front door open to find my entire family standing on the pristine front porch. Beatrice, Winston, Chloe, and Jamal were all dressed in their typical flashy designer clothes, projecting an image of immense, untouchable wealth. Beatrice was holding a pathetically small, incredibly cheap basket of discounted fruit, pushing it toward me with a bright, entirely fake smile. "Naomi, look at this place," Beatrice loudly exclaimed, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation to enter. She practically shoved the cheap fruit basket into my chest. "The security guard at the gate said you are house-sitting for some rich client. Honestly, it is a good thing you found some menial work, considering you probably have a mountain of medical debt to pay off now." Winston followed right behind her, his eyes darting around the grand foyer, taking in the expensive artwork and the crystal chandelier hanging above us. "Try not to break anything, Naomi," Winston warned, his tone dripping with his usual heavy condescension. "We cannot afford to bail you out if you damage these rich people's property. We are very busy with Jamal's massive corporate expansion." Chloe sauntered in next, linking her arm through Jamal's. She was wearing a completely inappropriate, tight sequined dress for a Tuesday afternoon, clearly trying to look like she belonged in a mansion like this. She did not even glance at the baby wrapped in my arms. "Ugh, this house is almost as nice as the one Jamal is looking to buy for us next month," Chloe bragged loudly, flipping her long, straightened hair over her shoulder. "But honestly, Naomi, you look terrible. You really should have put on some makeup before we got here." Jamal trailed in last, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He looked incredibly nervous, sweating slightly despite the cool temperature in the foyer. He completely ignored my near-death experience, completely ignoring the fact that just 10 days ago, they had all watched me bleed out on a kitchen floor and told me to call an Uber. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Jamal said, his voice tense and rushed. He walked straight into the main living room, completely uninvited, and dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the glass coffee table with a loud thud. "We are on a very tight schedule today, Naomi. We actually came here because we have a massive, incredibly lucrative business opportunity for you." I slowly closed the front door, making sure the lock clicked firmly into place. I walked into the living room and stood silently watching them make themselves entirely at home in Calvin's house. Beatrice immediately began criticizing the decor, while Chloe complained about the lack of champagne. They had completely, utterly ignored the fact that I had nearly died 10 days ago. They did not ask about my traumatic surgery. They did not ask if I was recovering well. They did not even ask for the name of their new granddaughter who was quietly sleeping against my chest. I looked at the thick stack of financial documents Jamal was rapidly pulling out of his leather briefcase. The trap was set perfectly, and they had just eagerly walked right into the very center of it. I shifted my weight, looking at Jamal, with a perfectly blank, unreadable expression. "What kind of business opportunity, Jamal?" I asked softly, my voice perfectly steady. Jamal slapped a heavy stack of complex commercial loan applications onto the glass coffee table, aggressively tapping the signature line with a gold-plated pen. I am rapidly expanding my luxury auto showrooms, Jamal boasted, puffing out his chest to look important. But the banks are being ridiculously difficult about releasing the funds quickly. I need a silent guarantor. Someone with a completely flawless credit score and zero existing debt to co-sign this temporary bridge loan. It is for $1.2 million. Since you are an auditor, your credit is perfect. Sign the papers. Naomi, and we can all get out of here. I stared at the loan documents, then looked up at my family, my eyes hardening into pure ice as the full terrifying weight of their absolute audacity settled heavily in the quiet room. I kept my expression completely impassive as Beatrice aggressively pushed the cheap yellow cellophane-wrapped fruit basket directly against my chest. She marched right past me without waiting for a single word of invitation, her sharp designer heels clicking loudly against the imported marble floor of the grand foyer. She paused in the center of the entryway, her eyes greedily sweeping up the sweeping curved staircase and lingering hungrily on the massive crystal chandelier hanging high above us. Beatrice let out a loud, highly condescending scoff. She turned back to me, her eyes raking over my simple, comfortable lounge clothes with undisguised contempt. She loudly stated that it was an absolute sheer miracle these wealthy homeowners had hired someone like me to watch such a magnificent property, especially considering my usual complete lack of personal presentation. She then launched immediately into a vicious, deeply rehearsed lecture about my perceived failures as a daughter and a Christian woman. Beatrice aggressively complained that I had not officially announced the birth of my child to Pastor Davis and the rest of the highly judgmental church board. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, stating that my reckless, selfish silence was actively making the entire family look incredibly unchristian and fractured. She claimed she had been forced to lie to the wealthy church elders all week, telling them I was away on a highly exclusive corporate auditing retreat, just to cover up the deeply embarrassing fact that I was a single mother hiding in a tiny rundown apartment. She told me I was a massive disappointment to her social standing and a stain on her flawless reputation. Chloe sauntered in right behind her mother, linking her arm tightly through Jamal's. She was wearing a tight, highly inappropriate silver sequined dress for a Tuesday afternoon, clearly trying to project an image of extreme wealth in a house she did not own. Chloe loudly complained that the stale air in my usual neighborhood always made her physically nauseous, and it was a very good thing I was temporarily staying in a place with proper high-end ventilation, so she did not have to suffer. She did not even glance at the tiny sleeping newborn resting warmly against my chest. She was entirely too busy sizing up the expensive modern artwork hanging on the walls. She loudly whispered to Beatrice that they should ask the real property owners for their interior designer's private contact information so she could use it for her own future mansion. Winston walked in next, puffing out his broad chest, as if he possessed the deed to the entire estate. He sharply warned me not to touch anything valuable, stating with absolute certainty that he and Beatrice absolutely would not bail me out financially if I accidentally broke a rich person's antique vase. He told me to stay in my lane and remember my place as the help. Finally, Jamal stepped over the threshold. He was sweating profusely through his custom-tailored, highly expensive designer suit. The thick, suffocating scent of his premium cologne completely failed to mask the sharp, sour odor of pure financial panic radiating from his entire body. Jamal did not say a single word about my health. He did not ask about my emergency trauma surgery. He did not ask the name of his new niece. He walked straight past me, his bloodshot eyes locked entirely on the large glass coffee table located in the center of the expansive living room. Jamal dropped a thick, heavy leather briefcase onto the glass surface with a loud, aggressive thud. He quickly snapped the brass locks open and pulled out a massive, intimidating stack of complex legal and financial documents. He slapped the heavy paperwork down onto the table, aggressively tapping the bottom signature line with a heavy gold-plated pen. I slowly closed the heavy front door, ensuring the deadbolt clicked firmly into place. I walked into the living room and stood silently watching them make themselves entirely at home in Calvin's house. I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting on the glass table. It was a commercial bridge loan application. The total amount requested was $1.2 million. Jamal flashed a bright, highly manufactured smile that was entirely too wide and painfully desperate. He launched into a rapid-fire, heavily rehearsed sales pitch. He loudly boasted that his luxury auto showrooms were rapidly expanding across the entire state, pulling in record-breaking revenue. He claimed he had successfully secured prime real estate locations and lined up exclusive high-end luxury inventory. However, he quickly added that the traditional corporate banking system was being ridiculously difficult about releasing the necessary capital quickly enough to meet his aggressive expansion timeline. He forcefully played the racial solidarity card, stating that the corporate banking system was inherently rigged against successful black businessmen, and that our family absolutely had to stick together to build true, lasting generational wealth. Jamal then looked directly at me, his eyes wide and pleading, but underlined with a dark, aggressive entitlement. He claimed he just needed a temporary silent guarantor. He stated he desperately needed someone with a completely flawless credit score and zero existing debt to co-sign this temporary bridge loan to satisfy the bank's outdated, heavily biased requirements. He explicitly pointed out that since I was a senior forensic auditor, my financial record was absolutely pristine and highly respected by commercial lenders. He loudly promised that I would not have to pay a single dime out of my own pocket. He swore on his life that my name would just sit quietly on the file for 6 short months, and then he would completely buy me out with the massive, undeniable profits from his new luxury showrooms. It was, according to his frantic pitch, a completely risk-free favor for the family that would elevate us all. Chloe loudly chimed in from the plush velvet sofa, crossing her long legs and glaring at me. She aggressively stated that Jamal was working 80-hour weeks to violently elevate the entire family's social and financial status. She demanded that I stop being so incredibly selfish, bitter, and jealous. She told me to finally do something useful for once in my pathetic, lonely life, instead of just holding on to my unwarranted resentment. She accused me of actively wanting to see her fail just because I was an ugly single baby mama who could not keep a man and who would always be entirely alone. Winston stepped forward, standing right beside Jamal to present a unified front of male authority. Winston crossed his massive arms, his fake supportive smile attempting to project a warm fatherly dominance. He told me that this was a golden, extremely rare opportunity for me to finally contribute something truly meaningful to the family legacy. He aggressively stated that they were generously handing me a chance to prove my familial loyalty and redeem myself in the eyes of the church community. I looked at the four of them standing in my fiancé's living room. They operated like a perfectly synchronized pack of starving wolves, each playing their specific, highly practiced role to safely corner and utterly devour their prey. Jamal played the charismatic, highly misunderstood visionary fighting against a rigged system. Chloe played the entitled, victimized golden child, whose lavish happiness was paramount above all else. Beatrice played the shaming, authoritative matriarch, wielding heavy social pressure and religious guilt as a lethal weapon. Winston played the heavy-handed, intimidating enforcer ready to crush any remaining resistance with brute psychological force. They truly believed I was entirely powerless against their combined assault. They believed the severe physical trauma of giving birth alone, combined with my supposed financial desperation, had severely weakened my mind, making me entirely ripe for a massive financial extraction. I knew exactly what would happen if I actually signed that legally binding paper. Within 30 short days, Jamal would intentionally and maliciously default on the massive commercial loan. He would quickly funnel the liquid cash directly into his hidden, highly encrypted offshore accounts to frantically pay off his most aggressive, dangerous underground investors. The commercial bank would instantly come after me, the legally bound, silent guarantor. They would completely destroy my pristine credit score, aggressively seize my personal assets, garnish my wages, and financially ruin me for the rest of my natural adult life. They were actively, consciously trying to sacrifice my entire future and my newborn daughter's stability, just so Chloe could buy another massive mansion and Beatrice could continue bragging relentlessly to the gullible church elders. I looked down at the signature line on the pristine white paper. I then looked directly into Jamal's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him I was not signing anything. I stated my absolute refusal with undeniable chilling finality. My voice was completely steady, devoid of any emotion, and incredibly cold. The entire room froze instantly. The arrogant, highly entitled atmosphere completely shattered in a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a sudden, heavy, suffocating tension that made the air feel incredibly thick. Jamal's mouth dropped wide open in genuine, unfiltered shock. He stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Chloe sat up perfectly straight on the velvet sofa, her eyes narrowing into furious, hateful slits as her golden child entitlement was directly challenged. Beatrice abruptly stopped inspecting an expensive antique vase, her head violently snapping toward me as if I had just forcefully slapped her across the face. Winston's fake, patronizing, fatherly smile completely vanished without a single trace. The friendly patriarch facade melted away instantly, fully revealing the highly aggressive, tyrannical nature he usually reserved for behind closed doors when he needed to enforce strict compliance. He marched heavily across the expensive Persian rug, violently snatching the gold-plated pen directly out of Jamal's sweating, trembling hand. He stepped directly into my personal space, his large, imposing frame towering over me in a deliberate, highly calculated attempt to physically intimidate me into total, unquestioning submission. He aggressively shoved the gold-plated pen directly toward my chest, the sharp metal tip stopping just inches from the soft blanket, wrapping my sleeping newborn daughter. "You owe this family. Sign the paper, Naomi." I did not flinch. The heavy gold-plated pen trembled slightly in Winston's massive fist, the sharp metal tip hovering dangerously close to my daughter's soft pink blanket. I looked straight up into his furious, bulging eyes, refusing to break eye contact. The sheer physical intimidation that had successfully kept me completely subjugated for the first 18 years of my life simply did not work anymore. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical disgust for the man standing over me. Winston saw the absolute defiance in my expression, and his face contorted into a mask of ugly, self-righteous rage. He took a heavy step backward, raising his hands in the air as if he were standing at the pulpit delivering a fiery Sunday sermon. "You are a traitor to your own blood!" Winston boomed, his voice echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings of Calvin's pristine living room. "Do you have any idea how incredibly hard it is for a black man to build a legitimate, thriving corporate empire in this country? The system is designed to completely crush us, Naomi. The commercial banks actively want to see Jamal fail. They want to see him lose his showrooms so they can hand those prime real estate locations over to someone else. And instead of standing behind your brother-in-law, instead of using your privileged position to lift up a successful black businessman, you are aggressively trying to tear him down out of pure, bitter jealousy." Winston pointed a thick, accusing finger directly at my face. "You are deliberately turning your back on your own people. You sit there with your natural hair and your self-righteous attitude, judging us for wanting a better life. We are trying to build real, lasting generational wealth for this entire family, and you are acting like a spiteful, treacherous enemy. If the community knew how you were actively sabotaging Jamal today, you would be entirely outcast." I remained perfectly still on the velvet sofa, holding my peacefully sleeping daughter against my chest. "Generational wealth is not built on fraudulent bank loans and stolen investor funds," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Jamal let out a loud, panicked scoff from the other side of the glass coffee table, wiping a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. "You do not know the first thing about corporate finance, Naomi. You are just a lowly desk auditor. You crunch boring numbers for a paycheck. You have absolutely no idea what it takes to operate at my high level." Before I could verbally destroy Jamal's pathetic, crumbling facade, Chloe aggressively threw herself into the center of the room. She violently collapsed onto the adjacent velvet armchair, burying her face in her manicured hands, and immediately began to sob. It was a masterful, highly practiced theatrical performance. She wailed loudly, her shoulders shaking with heavy, exaggerated heaves. "You just want to ruin my life!" Chloe screamed through her fake crocodile tears, glaring at me with eyes full of venomous hatred. "You have always hated me, Naomi. You have always been insanely jealous because I am the beautiful one, because Mom and Dad actually love me, and because I married a wealthy, successful man, while you can barely get a text back from whatever deadbeat left you. Chloe aggressively wiped her dry eyes, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. You desperately want to see me completely homeless. You want to see Jamal's massive business violently ripped away from us, just so you can feel a tiny bit better about your own miserable, pathetic existence. You are sitting there, a broke, ugly single baby mama, living off the scraps of whatever rich person actually owns this house, and you are maliciously using this one single opportunity to finally drag me down to the absolute slums with you. You are a sick, twisted, deeply bitter woman. Chloe's vicious, rapid-fire insults bounced harmlessly off my invisible armor. I looked at her twisted, angry face and felt a strange, profound sense of pity. She was completely dependent on Jamal's stolen money to maintain her fragile, entirely fabricated identity. Without the designer bags and the luxury cars, Chloe was absolutely nothing. Beatrice, realizing that Winston's heavy-handed physical intimidation and Chloe's dramatic weeping victim routine were completely failing to break my resolve, decided it was finally time to unleash her ultimate, most destructive weapon. She stepped forward, her expensive high heels sinking into the plush Persian rug, and pulled her latest model smartphone out of her designer handbag. Beatrice looked down at me with a smile so incredibly sinister and cold that it practically froze the air in the expansive living room. The fake, cheerful church lady persona was entirely gone, completely replaced by the ruthless, calculating manipulator who had terrorized my entire childhood. You have always been deeply, dangerously unstable, Naomi. Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a smooth, lethal, almost conversational tone. Even when you were a little girl, you were prone to highly irrational, destructive behavior. And it is painfully obvious to all of us that the severe trauma of giving birth completely alone has finally triggered a massive, irreversible psychological breakdown. Beatrice deliberately unlocked her phone screen, holding the glowing device up so I could clearly see the keypad. You are currently squatting in a stranger's house pretending you belong in this level of luxury. You are refusing to financially assist your own family out of pure psychotic spite. You look physically exhausted, completely unkempt, and entirely unfit to care for a fragile newborn baby. My heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs, but I did not let my perfectly blank expression change. I knew exactly where she was going with this vicious narrative. I am going to call Child Protective Services right now. Beatrice stated, her thumb hovering aggressively over the digital keypad. I am going to tell the state authorities that my eldest daughter has suffered a severe, violent psychotic break. I am going to tell them that you are currently endangering the life of an innocent child by aggressively squatting in a vacant property that you do not own. I will personally ensure the social workers immediately dispatch a police unit to this exact address. Beatrice took a slow, menacing step closer to the velvet sofa. They will violently drag you out of this house in handcuffs, Naomi. They will throw you into a sterile psychiatric ward for a mandatory 72-hour mental health evaluation. And while you are locked away in a padded room completely stripped of your rights, I will gladly step up as the concerned, stable, wealthy grandmother. The state will hand that baby directly over to me and Chloe. Chloe suddenly stopped her fake sobbing, sitting up straight in the armchair with a vicious, triumphant smirk spreading across her heavily contoured face. We would raise her in a proper high society environment, Naomi. We would actually give her a good life completely far away from your toxic, broke, single mother mentality. You will never see this child again, Beatrice whispered, delivering the final fatal threat with absolute terrifying conviction. Unless you pick up that gold-plated pen right now, sign your name on every single page of Jamal's loan application, and apologize for your extreme disrespect. If you sign the paper, I will put my phone away, and we can all go back to being a happy, loving family. The choice is entirely yours, Naomi. Your signature or your daughter. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the grand living room. The threat was absolute. They were completely willing to weaponize the government, falsely accuse me of a severe mental health crisis, and violently rip my newborn daughter from my arms, all to secure a fraudulent commercial loan to fund their fake, lavish lifestyle. There was no line they would not cross. There was no depth of depravity they would not happily sink to in order to maintain their precious social status. For 10 seconds, nobody moved a single muscle. Jamal stood frozen, sweating profusely, waiting for his much-needed financial salvation. Winston stood with his arms crossed, projecting raw, aggressive dominance. Chloe sat eagerly, her eyes shining with greedy, malicious anticipation. And Beatrice stood holding her phone like a loaded weapon, her thumb hovering over the screen, ready to utterly destroy my entire life with a single phone call. They fully expected me to scream. They fully expected me to break down into a puddle of hysterical, terrified tears and desperately beg for their mercy. They expected me to violently snatch the pen and blindly sign my name just to protect my baby. Instead, my hands completely stopped shaking. The lingering dull pain from my emergency surgery entirely vanished, fully replaced by a surge of pure freezing adrenaline. I looked at the four faces staring down at me, and my expression turned to pure, absolute ice. I slowly reached down into the side pocket of my high-end, heavily concealed designer diaper bag, resting on the sofa cushion next to me. I did not pull out a pen. I did not pull out a tissue to dry non-existent tears. Winston's massive chest heaved as he let out a loud, aggressive snort, entirely dismissing my sudden, unexpected shift in tone. "What kind of crazy, psychotic nonsense are you rambling about now, Naomi? Stop trying to desperately change the subject and sign the damn legal papers before your mother makes that phone call and ends your entire pathetic existence." Beatrice narrowed her sharp eyes, her thumb still resting heavily on her phone screen. She was actively trying to calculate what I was doing, her manipulative brain working in overdrive to maintain her absolute control over the situation. She had expected total immediate surrender when she threatened to take my daughter. She had not expected me to calmly reach into my bag and pivot the conversation. "Do not play games with me, little girl," Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with pure concentrated venom. "I am not bluffing. I have the direct personal phone number for the Regional Director of Child Protective Services stored right here in my contacts. She attends our Sunday evening service. She will dispatch an emergency removal team to this estate in less than 15 minutes, based entirely on my personal, highly respected recommendation. You are completely out of options." "I am not playing a game, Mother," I replied smoothly, my fingers firmly grasping the thick manila envelope hidden inside the diaper bag. "I am simply changing the terms of this negotiation." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic groan, aggressively throwing her hands up in the air. "Oh my God, she really has completely lost her mind, Jamal. Just take the papers back. We cannot use a silent guarantor who is going to be locked up in a mental asylum by the end of the day. The commercial bank will do a background check and see that she was forcibly committed." "Shut up, Chloe," Jamal snapped nervously, his panic skyrocketing as he realized his $1.2 million lifeline was rapidly slipping away. He desperately needed my signature today. He stepped closer to the glass coffee table, trying to salvage his failing pitch. "Naomi, please, just ignore your mother. Nobody is calling anyone. Just sign the document and we will leave you alone in this house. You can go right back to your quiet life." I slowly pulled the thick manila envelope out of the bag and placed it squarely on top of Jamal's fraudulent loan application. The room went entirely still once again. "You want to talk about protecting children and family solidarity?" I repeated, my eyes locking onto Beatrice's suddenly pale, shocked face. "Let us finally talk about the $80,000. I stared directly at the sharp metal tip of the gold-plated pen. Winston's massive chest heaved with heavy, aggressive exertion, his breathing ragged and loud in the quiet room. He honestly believed his sheer physical presence alone would be enough to break my spirit, exactly as it always had when I was a terrified teenager living under his rigid, dictatorial roof. But I was absolutely no longer that scared, compliant little girl. I slowly reached down into the side pocket of my heavily concealed designer diaper bag. I did not pull out a tissue to dry non-existent tears. I pulled out a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. I calmly swatted Winston's hand away, pushing the gold-plated pen aside with a firm, dismissive flick of my wrist. I dropped the heavy manila envelope directly on top of Jamal's fraudulent commercial loan application. The thick packet hit the glass coffee table with a heavy, deeply satisfying smack. "You want to talk about protecting children and Black family solidarity?" I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerously calm, absolutely lethal register. "Let us talk about the $80,000. Jamal frowned, stepping back from the coffee table in utter confusion. Chloe rolled her eyes, loudly groaning, as if I were bringing up ancient, completely irrelevant history to ruin her day. But Beatrice and Winston instantly froze. The aggressive, domineering posture Winston had just been projecting completely vanished. Beatrice's mouth snapped shut. The color rapidly drained from both of their faces, leaving them looking entirely sick and panicked. I reached out and flipped the manila envelope open. I pulled out a thick stack of highly detailed, officially stamped bank statements and loan origination documents. I aggressively spread them out across the glass table, ensuring every single signature line and heavily highlighted financial figure was clearly visible under the bright lights of the crystal chandelier. 4 years ago, I began speaking slowly and deliberately, so every single word would hit its mark. 4 years ago, you two sat in a predatory lending office on the south side of the city. You desperately needed cash because Chloe had absolutely insisted on having a massive, extravagant destination wedding to impress Jamal's wealthy fraternity brothers. You frantically needed to rent the luxury estate, book the premium catering, and buy the custom-imported silk dress. But your credit was already completely maxed out from years of keeping up fake, lavish appearances at the church. So, you forged my signature. I tapped my manicured fingernail heavily against the highly forged, totally fraudulent signature on the bottom of the original loan agreement. You maliciously used my name, my social security number, and my pristine credit history to take out an $80,000 predatory personal loan at a highly illegal interest rate. I stated, my eyes locking onto Beatrice's terrified face. You completely stole my financial identity to fund a massive, over-the-top party for your golden child. And then when the predatory lenders aggressively came to collect their massive payments just 6 months later, you completely abandoned the debt. You deliberately left me holding the bag. Winston nervously cleared his throat, suddenly refusing to meet my direct gaze. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes, the very same shoes he had bought using the money he actively stole from my future. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I demanded, my voice rising with years of heavily suppressed righteous anger. I was actively trying to build my professional auditing career. I was trying to secure my very first apartment. The aggressive, ruthless collection agencies started calling my workplace constantly. They loudly threatened to garnish my wages. They aggressively threatened to have me criminally prosecuted for financial fraud because the loan was technically in severe default under my name. I had to work 3 separate, exhausting jobs just to keep myself out of a state prison for a massive debt I did not even owe. I explicitly described the brutal, suffocating reality of my life 4 years ago. I told them about waking up at 4 in the morning to scrub floors at a corporate office building, rushing to my entry-level accounting job during the day, and then waitressing at a busy diner until past midnight. I told them about the days I physically survived on cheap instant noodles and tap water, because every single spare penny had to go toward paying off the exorbitant predatory interest rates they had maliciously dumped onto my shoulders to protect their fake wealth. Beatrice aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, immediately slipping right back into her toxic, highly manipulative matriarch persona. She scoffed loudly, tossing her head back with absolute unapologetic arrogance. "So what?" Beatrice loudly demanded, her voice dripping with extreme toxic entitlement. "We gave you life, Naomi. We brought you into this world, and we kept a solid roof over your head for 18 years. You are the older sister. It was your fundamental God-given duty to ensure your younger sister had the perfect, beautiful start to her new married life. In our culture, the village sacrifices for the success of the family. You should have been incredibly proud to contribute to Chloe's happiness, instead of jealously holding on to this bitter, toxic resentment." I stared at my mother, completely astounded by her sheer, unadulterated delusion. "You call identity theft and federal financial fraud a family contribution?" I asked coldly. Chloe aggressively leaned forward on the velvet sofa, waving her freshly manicured hand in my direction. "Oh, just get over it, Naomi," Chloe yelled, entirely unbothered by the undeniable fact that her lavish dream wedding was directly funded by my absolute misery. "You survived, did you not? You are sitting here right now perfectly fine. You already paid the stupid debt off years ago. Stop acting like you are some kind of tragic, deeply suffering martyr just to avoid helping Jamal today. You are so incredibly dramatic and obsessed with the past. I looked down at Chloe. A slow, devastating, deeply terrifying smile spread across my face. The absolute delicious perfection of this exact moment washed over me, fueling my spirit with pure freezing power. I did not pay it off, Chloe. Chloe, I replied, my voice dropping to a soft, incredibly lethal whisper. The room went completely, utterly silent. Jamal looked wildly between me and the massive financial documents resting on the table. Winston took a shaky, nervous breath. Beatrice dropped her arms, her fake confidence suddenly faltering. What do you mean you did not pay it off? Winston asked, his voice trembling with a sudden, deeply rooted fear. The collection agencies completely stopped calling us 3 years ago. The loan was clearly settled. I slowly reached back into the thick manila envelope and pulled out one final heavy legal document. It was stamped with the official, undeniable seal of the state county clerk. I placed it gently on top of the forged loan agreement. I did not pay off the debt. I repeated, making sure every single syllable landed with absolute maximum destruction. I tracked down the aggressive predatory holding company that originally purchased your defaulted loan. And instead of paying them the remaining balance, I actively used my professional auditing credentials and my private corporate connections to legally buy the entire debt portfolio myself. Beatrice's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as her manipulative brain finally began to process the terrifying reality of my words. Which means I continued leaning forward and resting my hands firmly on the glass coffee table. I am currently the sole legal owner of your $80,000 loan. And because you two were incredibly foolish enough to secretly put up the deed to your sprawling suburban home as the primary collateral for that specific loan, I now legally hold the absolute rights to that collateral. I pointed my finger directly at Winston's heavy chest. Legally speaking, Mom and Dad's house now belongs entirely to me. The sheer absolute magnitude of my statement hit the room like a massive explosive shockwave. Chloe gasped loudly, pressing her hands against her mouth in genuine, unfiltered terror. Jamal stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the velvet armchair, as he realized the wealthy family he was desperately trying to leech off of was currently drowning in their own massive, inescapable financial ruin. Beatrice clutched her chest, her breathing becoming rapid and incredibly shallow. "You are lying," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. "You are a broke, pathetic single mother. You do not have the liquid cash to buy a corporate debt portfolio. You are bluffing to scare us into dropping the CPS threat. Look at the county seal on the deed transfer, Mother," I said smoothly, gesturing to the heavily stamped legal document resting on the table. It was officially finalized and filed over 2 years ago. I have been quietly holding on to your mortgage, patiently waiting for the exact right moment to legally foreclose on the property. And since you just aggressively threatened to call Child Protective Services and have my newborn daughter violently ripped away from me, I strongly believe that moment has finally arrived. Winston's face turned a dangerous, violent shade of dark purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged heavily against his tight, expensive shirt collar. The terrifying realization that his entire elevated social status, his pristine reputation as a wealthy church elder, and his actual physical home had been entirely secretly owned by the daughter he aggressively despised, completely shattered his fragile, arrogant ego. He let out a loud, terrifying, animalistic roar of pure, unfiltered rage. His massive hands balled into tight, aggressive fists. "You ungrateful, treacherous little snake!" Winston bellowed, stepping aggressively toward me. "I will teach you some respect right now." Winston forcefully raised his heavy, massive hand high into the air, his face twisted in absolute violent fury. He fully intended to physically strike me down right there in the center of the living room, completely willing to use extreme violence to forcefully beat me back into total submission. He swung his thick arm backward, putting his entire heavy body weight into the impending blow. I did not move. I did not flinch. I just stared straight up into his furious eyes, calmly waiting for his absolute final destruction. Before his heavy hand could even begin to fall toward my face, a deep, booming, incredibly dangerous voice echoed like heavy thunder from the cracked mahogany door of the adjacent home office. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Winston's massive arm froze in midair. The sheer terrifying authority echoing from the cracked mahogany door acted like an invisible brick wall, instantly shattering his violent momentum. His heavily balled fist hovered just inches above my face, trembling slightly, as the sudden booming voice completely derailed his aggressive tirade. I did not flinch, nor did I break eye contact with the man who had spent my entire life trying to crush me into submission. I stared directly into his wide, suddenly panicked eyes, leaning just a fraction of an inch closer to his frozen, sweating face. I delivered the words I had been patiently holding on to for 10 agonizing days, ensuring every single syllable sliced through the heavy silence like a razor blade. That night, you abandoned my baby and me. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the lethal, undeniable weight of an absolute death sentence. You threw $50 at me while I was bleeding out on a luxury Persian rug, explicitly telling me not to ruin your golden child's expensive party. You made your choice then, Winston. Now you get to live with the devastating consequences. The heavy mahogany doors of the adjacent home office did not just open, they were pushed completely apart with a slow, deliberate, incredibly intimidating force. The brass hinges let out a soft, echoing creak that sounded like a final judgment in the sprawling, vaulted living room. Calvin Sterling stepped out into the bright light of the crystal chandelier. He moved with the effortless, terrifying grace of an apex predator who had just patiently watched a pack of rabid scavengers walk directly into his inescapable trap. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored bespoke suit that projected pure, unadulterated wealth, not the loud, flashy, heavily branded garments Jamal and Chloe wore to falsely signal their status, but the quiet, lethal elegance of a man who actually owned the bank they owed their lives to. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks with a slow, measured precision, his dark, piercing eyes sweeping over the four intruders standing in his living room. The air temperature in the estate seemed to drop 10 degrees the second he crossed the threshold. Winston slowly lowered his heavy arm, stumbling backward until his calves hit the edge of the velvet armchair. His arrogant dictatorial presence evaporated instantly, rapidly replaced by the primal instinctive fear of a bully who suddenly realized he was standing in the presence of a much larger, far more dangerous power. But it was Jamal whose reaction was the most absolute catastrophic spectacle. Jamal turned his head toward the home office, his bloodshot eyes widening so drastically I thought they might physically pop out of his sweating skull. The heavy gold-plated pen he had been aggressively brandishing just moments ago slipped completely through his trembling fingers, hitting the glass coffee table with a sharp, pathetic clatter. He let out a strange, strangled gasp, sounding exactly like a man who had just been violently punched in the stomach. He recognized the man standing in the doorway instantly. For the past 6 months, Jamal had been desperately, aggressively trying to secure a single 5-minute pitch meeting with Calvin Sterling. Jamal's fraudulent luxury auto showroom empire was rapidly hemorrhaging millions of dollars, and his dangerous underground investors were aggressively demanding their stolen cash back. Sterling Holdings, Calvin's massive private equity firm, was the absolute holy grail of venture capital. A single financial injection from Calvin Sterling could easily wipe away all of Jamal's illegal debts and instantly legitimize his crumbling fake empire. Jamal had sent hundreds of desperate emails, aggressively harassed Calvin's executive assistants, and practically stalked the perimeter of Sterling Holdings' corporate headquarters, just hoping for a fleeting chance to pitch his business model. And now the billionaire venture capitalist, he viewed as his ultimate literal savior, was standing right in front of him, having just witnessed his entire family aggressively threaten a newborn baby and a vulnerable mother over a pathetic commercial bridge loan. Beatrice, standing rigidly beside the antique console table, let out a loud, high-pitched gasp, her heavily manicured hands flying up to cover her open mouth. The vicious, snarling expression she had worn just seconds ago was completely wiped away, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, starstruck terror. She recognized him too, but from a completely different, equally desperate angle. For the past 3 years, the elite board of elders at Beatrice's highly exclusive megachurch had been actively, aggressively hunting for Calvin Sterling. He was renowned throughout the entire state for his massive multi-million-dollar philanthropic donations. Beatrice had personally spearheaded a committee desperately trying to lure the elusive billionaire to attend just one of their Sunday services, knowing that securing a donation from Sterling Holdings would instantly elevate her social status to the absolute highest tier of the church hierarchy. She had spent hours boasting to the congregation that she had insider connections to his corporate team, a blatant fabricated lie designed to make her look incredibly important. Now the very billionaire she had been aggressively using for social clout was glaring at her with an expression of pure unadulterated disgust. Chloe remained entirely clueless for a fraction of a second, her heavily contoured face twisting in deep confusion as she watched her arrogant husband and her domineering parents completely freeze in absolute terror. She looked at Calvin, taking in his extreme wealth and his commanding presence, and her shallow, greedy mind immediately began calculating how she could use this new arrival to her advantage. She aggressively fluffed her straightened hair, straightening her posture on the velvet sofa, preparing to deploy her usual highly toxic charm. But Jamal did not even give her a chance to speak. The absolute blinding desperation to save his sinking financial ship completely overrode whatever tiny shred of familial loyalty or situational awareness he possessed. He aggressively shoved past Winston, practically shoving his own father-in-law out of the way, and scrambled frantically toward the center of the grand living room. He wiped his heavily sweating palms on his custom-tailored trousers, completely abandoning the aggressive, demanding posture he had used against me just moments ago. He transformed instantly into a fawning, desperate beggar. Jamal scrambled to put on his best salesman smile, rushing forward with his hand out. "Mr. Sterling. Sir, what an honor. I had no idea you owned this estate. We were just leaving. We were just dropping by to quickly check on my sister-in-law, who is temporarily house-sitting the property for you. If I had known you were currently in residence, I would have brought a proper presentation portfolio." "This is an incredibly serendipitous meeting, sir." Beatrice immediately snapped out of her shocked paralysis, her social climbing instincts kicking into severe overdrive. She aggressively pushed past Chloe, practically sprinting across the Persian rug to stand right beside Jamal. She smoothed down the front of her expensive designer dress, aggressively projecting the fake, overly sweet church matriarch persona she used to manipulate the local congregation. "Mr. Sterling, what a true, unexpected blessing from the Lord," Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sugary sweetness. She aggressively stepped forward, totally ignoring the undeniable fact that she had just violently threatened to call Child Protective Services on me less than 2 minutes ago. "I am Beatrice, Naomi's mother. We have been praying fervently for an opportunity to welcome you to our Sunday service. I am a senior member of the church board, and we would be absolutely honored to host you." Beatrice shot me a dark, vicious, highly threatening look out of the corner of her eye, a silent, aggressive command, demanding that I play along with their fabricated narrative. She quickly turned her beaming fake smile back to Calvin. "Naomi is just helping out with some light property maintenance today." Beatrice lied smoothly, her voice utterly devoid of any shame. "We were just stepping in to ensure she was doing a satisfactory job maintaining your beautiful home. She can be a bit unreliable sometimes, as I am sure you have noticed." Winston, quickly realizing that aggressively attacking me in front of a prominent billionaire would completely destroy their carefully crafted image of wealthy respectability, immediately straightened his posture. He aggressively pulled his suit jacket down, trying to regain his false, dignified composure. "Yes, indeed," Winston added, stepping forward to present a unified, highly respectable front alongside his wife and son-in-law. "We run a very tight, highly successful family unit, Mr. Sterling. Jamal here is a rising star in the commercial automotive industry. We are a family of extremely driven, highly ambitious Black entrepreneurs. It is a genuine pleasure to cross paths with a man of your profound business stature." Chloe, quickly catching on to the rapid shift in power dynamics, stood up from the velvet sofa. She aggressively smoothed down her entirely inappropriate sequined dress, attempting to look like an elegant high society wife rather than a vicious entitled bully. She flashed Calvin a bright, flirtatious smile, completely dismissing my presence on the sofa, as if I were a piece of invisible, irrelevant furniture. I sat perfectly still, holding my quietly sleeping daughter against my chest, watching this utterly repulsive, deeply pathetic display of absolute sycophancy. Just moments ago, they were aggressively threatening to destroy my entire life, steal my child, and force me into permanent financial ruin. Now they were falling over themselves to impress the man they wrongly assumed was my temporary employer. They were so incredibly blinded by their own toxic greed, their desperate social climbing, and their absolute disdain for me that they could not see the massive, heavily armed trap snapping shut directly over their heads. Calvin ignores his hand, walks straight to Naomi, kisses her forehead, and looks at Jamal. I'm not the homeowner, I'm her fiancé. The sheer impossibility of Calvin Sterling's words hung heavily in the air, completely paralyzing the four people standing in the center of the grand living room. I sat perfectly still on the velvet sofa, holding my sleeping daughter, watching their arrogant minds violently short-circuit. They had aggressively built their entire reality around the absolute certainty that I was a broken, isolated, utterly worthless failure. The sudden, undeniable revelation that the most powerful billionaire in the state was not my temporary employer, but my future husband, utterly destroyed their toxic narrative in a fraction of a second. Jamal slowly lowered his extended, sweating hand. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, gasping for air like a fish thrown violently onto dry land. Chloe's fake high society smile completely dissolved, rapidly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic as she stared at the massive diamond ring I had kept carefully hidden inside my pocket for the past 10 days, but which Calvin now subtly gestured toward. Beatrice was the very first to break the suffocating silence. Her social climbing instincts, honed by decades of aggressively manipulating church congregations and country club boards, kicked into severe, desperate overdrive. She did not apologize for threatening to call Child Protective Services. She did not show a single ounce of genuine remorse for leaving me to bleed out in a freezing alleyway. Instead, she seamlessly pivoted, aggressively transforming her entire persona with a speed that was genuinely terrifying to witness. "Oh, praise the Lord!" Beatrice suddenly shrieked, pressing both of her heavily manicured hands against her chest, as if she were experiencing a profound religious revelation. She aggressively pushed past Jamal and marched straight toward me, her eyes shining with fake manufactured tears of absolute joy. "Naomi, my precious, beautiful daughter. Why on earth did you keep such a magnificent, incredible secret from your own mother? You always were so incredibly modest, so delightfully humble." Beatrice actually had the sheer, unbelievable audacity to reach down and attempt to gently stroke the soft pink blanket wrapped tightly around my newborn daughter. I smoothly shifted my shoulder, pulling my baby completely out of her reach. Beatrice did not even flinch at my rejection. She simply turned her beaming, utterly soulless smile directly up toward Calvin, aggressively projecting the image of a doting, deeply loving matriarch. "Mr. Sterling, you have absolutely no idea how incredibly happy this makes my heart," Beatrice gushed, her voice dripping with thick, sickeningly sweet syrup. "We have always prayed so fervently for Naomi to find a strong, successful black man to properly guide her. Always been a bit lost, a bit of a wandering soul, but clearly the Lord was just saving her for you. We are absolutely thrilled to finally welcome you into our tightly knit family. You simply must come to Sunday dinner at our home. I will cook your favorite meal." Winston quickly recovered from his own shock, eagerly jumping on Beatrice's toxic bandwagon. He puffed out his broad chest aggressively, attempting to project a sense of wealthy masculine solidarity with the billionaire standing before him. Winston let out a loud, hearty, entirely fake chuckle, aggressively slapping his large hands together. "Well, I will be damned," Winston boomed, taking a confident step toward Calvin. He aggressively extended his right hand, completely ignoring the fact that he had just aggressively threatened to physically strike me down mere seconds ago. I always knew my eldest daughter had a brilliant head on her shoulders. She clearly recognized a fellow king when she saw one. It takes a very strong, powerful patriarch to recognize another Calvin. From one successful black man to another, I give you my absolute, unequivocal blessing. Welcome to the family, son. I watched my parents completely humiliate themselves, absolutely nauseated by their breathtaking lack of shame. They were so blinded by their desperate, ravenous greed that they completely ignored the cold, lethal fury radiating from Calvin's dark eyes. They truly believed they could simply reset the entire relationship instantly, erasing decades of severe emotional abuse just because I was now suddenly attached to massive, undeniable wealth. But it was Jamal who took the absolute prize for staggering, unfiltered audacity. Jamal had been staring at Calvin with a look of pure, starving desperation. His fraudulent auto showroom empire was actively collapsing. His dangerous underground investors were aggressively demanding their stolen cash, and his $1.2 million commercial loan application was currently sitting completely unsigned on the glass coffee table. When Calvin explicitly stated that we were engaged, Jamal did not see a protective partner stepping in to defend me. Jamal only saw a massive walking, breathing bank vault that was suddenly miraculously tied to him by marriage. Jamal aggressively wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his expensive suit sleeve. A wide, completely manic, highly eager smile violently stretched across his face. He stepped right in front of Winston, actively pushing his father-in-law aside to get closer to Calvin. "Calvin, man, this is absolutely incredible news!" Jamal shouted, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated adrenaline and severe financial panic. "Listen, man, since we are practically brothers now, since we are officially family, this completely changes everything. This is a massive game changer for both of us." Jamal aggressively gestured toward the thick stack of legal documents resting on the glass coffee table. He excitedly clapped his hands together, launching into his desperate, highly rehearsed pitch with renewed, frantic energy. "I was just explaining this massive business opportunity to Naomi," Jamal continued rapidly, his words stumbling over each other in his desperate haste. "But honestly, Calvin, you are the exact man I really need to speak with. The commercial banks are giving me the absolute runaround. They are aggressively discriminating against me, putting up massive racist roadblocks to prevent a successful black entrepreneur from rapidly expanding his luxury auto empire. I just need a quick $1.2 million bridge loan to secure 3 prime real estate locations downtown. The inventory is locked. The high-end clientele is already lined up. It is a completely guaranteed, risk-free massive return on investment." Chloe aggressively nodded along from the velvet armchair, completely buying into her husband's frantic, desperate delusion. She aggressively smoothed her sequined dress, flashing Calvin a bright, flirtatious smile. "Jamal is a total visionary, Calvin. He is aggressively building a massive generational empire for this family. Since you are marrying my sister, you really should keep your investment capital strictly in the family. It only makes sense to elevate your own bloodline." Jamal eagerly leaned forward, aggressively tapping the glass table. "Exactly!" Jamal shouted, pointing a sweating finger at Calvin. "We do not even need Naomi to sign this stupid commercial bank application anymore. We do not need to deal with their ridiculous, outdated red tape. You can just bypass the banks entirely, Calvin. You can directly fund my massive expansion right here, right now, out of your own private equity capital. You cut me a check for $1.2 million today, and I will personally guarantee you a massive 30% return in less than 6 months. We can actively conquer this entire city together, brother." The four of them stood in the center of the grand living room, eagerly waiting for Calvin to pull out his elite exclusive checkbook and miraculously shower them with unimaginable wealth. They honestly, truly believed their aggressive, toxic manipulation had perfectly succeeded. They believed they had successfully cornered the billionaire. Calvin did not smile. He did not extend his hand to accept Winston's fake, overly familiar greeting. He did not acknowledge Beatrice's sickening, sugary praises. And he absolutely did not agree to fund Jamal's frantic, desperate business pitch. Calvin's expression remained completely blank, a mask of pure, freezing, lethal ice. He slowly walked past Winston and Beatrice, entirely ignoring their presence as if they were nothing but irrelevant, annoying insects buzzing around his pristine home. He stopped directly in front of the large glass coffee table. Jamal eagerly stepped back, giving Calvin room, a massive, greedy smile splitting his sweating face. Jamal fully expected Calvin to pick up the gold-plated pen and sign a massive investment contract right then and there. Calvin looked down at the thick, heavy commercial loan application resting on the table. He slowly reached out with his large, perfectly manicured hands. He firmly grasped the thick stack of legal papers, and with one swift, aggressive, incredibly powerful motion, Calvin violently tore the entire $1.2 million commercial loan application directly in half. The loud, sharp sound of thick, heavy paper being violently ripped apart echoed like a gunshot through the silent, expansive living room. Calvin aggressively dropped the torn, completely ruined pieces of Jamal's financial salvation directly onto the imported Persian rug, scattering the useless white shreds across the floor. Jamal's massive, greedy smile instantly vanished. He let out a loud, highly panicked gasp, his hands flying up to clutch his sweating head. "What are you doing?" Jamal screamed, sheer, unadulterated terror rapidly bleeding into his frantic voice. "That was my official banking application. I needed those documents." Calvin completely ignored Jamal's hysterical outburst. He calmly reached down and unlatched the brass locks of his own sleek, custom-made leather briefcase resting beside the sofa. He reached inside and slowly pulled out a massive, incredibly thick, heavily bound legal binder. The front cover of the binder was aggressively stamped with a large, bright red, highly intimidating seal that read, "Strictly Confidential, Forensic Financial Audit." Calvin raised the massive binder high in the air and forcefully slammed it down onto the glass coffee table. The heavy binder hit the glass with a loud, aggressive, deeply terrifying thud that made Chloe physically jump out of her velvet armchair. "You are not expanding your luxury auto showrooms, Jamal," Calvin stated, his deep voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable, lethal authority. "You are completely, utterly drowning." Winston's jaw dropped open. Beatrice took a shaky, nervous step backward, her eyes locked on the intimidating red stamp on the cover of the binder. "You are currently drowning in over $4 million of aggressive, high-interest, highly illegal underground debt." Calvin continued flawlessly reciting the exact devastating financial figures I had spent weeks carefully verifying. "You do not own any prime real estate locations. You do not have any high-end luxury inventory. You have absolutely zero legitimate revenue streams." Jamal's face turned an incredibly dangerous, sickly shade of pale gray. He aggressively shook his head, frantically backing away from the table as if the red-stamped binder was a live, ticking bomb. "You do not know what you are talking about," Jamal stammered wildly, his voice cracking with extreme panic. "My business is booming. My corporate books are flawless. You have been running a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme for the past 3 years," Calvin stated coldly, mercilessly destroying Jamal's entire fabricated existence. "You have been aggressively using fake, entirely fabricated vehicle identification numbers to forcefully secure multiple massive commercial loans. You have been violently defrauding your private high-net-worth investors to aggressively fund your wife's lavish, utterly fake designer lifestyle. You are a complete, utter fraud, Jamal, and your entire criminal empire is crashing down today." The absolute sheer magnitude of Calvin's words hit the room like a devastating, catastrophic earthquake. Winston grabbed the edge of the antique console table to keep his heavy body from collapsing. Beatrice let out a loud, high-pitched, terrified wail, aggressively clutching her chest. Chloe violently launched herself forward, her face twisted in an ugly, vicious sneer of pure, unfiltered rage and deep denial. "You are lying!" Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing an aggressively trembling finger directly at Calvin. "You are making all of this up to aggressively ruin my husband. Jamal is a highly successful, wealthy CEO. His private corporate financial books are heavily encrypted. He uses elite, highly secure offshore accounting software. There is absolutely no possible way you could have ever gained access to his private internal financial records." Calvin slowly turned his head to look at Chloe. A slow, incredibly dark, deeply devastating smirk slowly spread across his handsome face. He did not say a single word. He simply raised his hand and pointed his index finger directly at me. Calvin slowly extended his arm, pointing his index finger directly at me. The silence in the living room became so absolute, so incredibly dense, that I could clearly hear the faint rhythmic ticking of Calvin's platinum wristwatch. Every single eye in the room violently snapped toward me, completely abandoning the massive red-stamped binder resting on the coffee table. They stared at me with an intense, rapidly shifting mixture of sheer confusion, sudden apprehension, and deep instinctual fear. The carefully constructed, completely fabricated reality. they had aggressively forced me to inhabit for my entire life was actively shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Chloe was the very first to break the suffocating silence. Her mouth fell open in an ugly, highly unattractive expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. She violently whipped her head between me and Calvin, her sequined dress catching the light from the crystal chandelier. Her! Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking violently, as she pointed an aggressively trembling manicured finger in my direction. You are pointing at Naomi. You are completely out of your mind, Calvin. My sister is a broke, pathetic accountant. She sits in a tiny, depressing cubicle all day and manually inputs basic numbers into an incredibly outdated spreadsheet. She has absolutely zero high-level corporate security clearance. She could not possibly have gained access to Jamal's private encrypted multi-million-dollar financial books. You are aggressively lying to protect this ugly, bitter baby mama. Calvin slowly lowered his arm, his dark eyes never once leaving Chloe's frantic, heavily contoured face. He let out a low, dark chuckle that completely lacked any trace of actual amusement. It was a cold, lethal, incredibly dangerous sound that instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You really should have actively asked your sister what she actually does for a living, Calvin stated smoothly, his deep voice slicing through Chloe's hysterical outburst with lethal precision. Instead of just aggressively calling her a broke accountant for the past 10 years, you should have paid attention to her actual highly specialized career path. It would have saved your fraudulent husband a massive amount of legal trouble. Winston aggressively stepped forward, his massive chest puffing out in a desperate, deeply pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of patriarchal authority in a room where he had already completely lost all control. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a dark, threatening fury. Naomi, what kind of ridiculous fabricated lies have you been telling this man? Winston aggressively demanded, completely defaulting to his usual highly toxic tactic of actively blaming me for every single problem. Have you been maliciously spreading fake rumors about Jamal's successful business to aggressively tear down his sterling reputation? I explicitly raised you to be a loyal, supportive black woman, not a treacherous, jealous snake. I did not flinch. I did not avert my eyes. I gently adjusted the soft pink blanket around my sleeping daughter's tiny shoulders, ensuring she remained completely peaceful and undisturbed by the chaotic storm raging around us. I slowly stood up from the plush velvet sofa, my movements deliberate and incredibly calm. I looked directly into Winston's bulging, furious eyes. I did not have to spread a single fabricated lie about Jamal, father. I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, absolute certainty. I simply verified the undeniable, heavily documented mathematical truth. Beatrice clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, her face turning an incredibly dangerous, sickly shade of pale gray. Her social climbing brain was desperately trying to process the horrifying implication of my words, but her deep-rooted, blinding arrogance actively prevented her from accepting the terrifying reality. Verified what truth, Naomi? Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. You are just a low-level, completely irrelevant numbers cruncher. You have absolutely no power or influence in the real corporate world. I am the Senior Director of Forensic Auditing for Sterling Holdings, I stated smoothly, officially delivering the massive, lethal professional blow I had patiently held onto for over 6 years. The utter absolute shock that instantly washed over my family's faces was a spectacular, deeply satisfying picture of pure, unadulterated devastation. Jamal stumbled backward, his knees violently hitting the edge of the glass coffee table. He let out a loud, high-pitched gasp, sounding exactly like a man who had just been violently shoved out of a high-flying airplane without a parachute. He frantically looked between me and the massive red-stamped binder, the horrifying realization of his impending destruction rapidly setting in. You, Jamal stammered wildly, his entire body beginning to shake uncontrollably. You work for Sterling Holdings, you are the Senior Director of Forensic Auditing, but that means... That means I was the exact person officially assigned to heavily audit your massive commercial loan application when you desperately submitted it to our venture capital division 6 months ago. I confirmed coldly, stepping closer to the glass table. You arrogantly believed you could simply submit a stack of highly falsified, heavily doctored financial statements to a massive private equity firm and magically walk away with $5 million in clean investment capital. You aggressively assumed the corporate bankers would be too lazy, too stupid, or too intimidated by your fake confidence to actually dig into the complex, encrypted layers of your fraudulent auto showroom empire. I slowly picked up the heavy red stamped binder. I looked directly at Jamal, my expression turning to pure freezing ice. You were completely, utterly wrong, Jamal. I personally tracked every single stolen, defrauded dollar. I actively traced every fake, entirely fabricated vehicle identification number you illegally used to secure multiple massive commercial loans across 3 different states. I heavily documented every single highly encrypted illegal offshore bank account you actively used to illegally funnel your private investors' money to aggressively fund Chloe's lavish, completely fake designer lifestyle. Chloe let out a loud, hysterical shriek, violently throwing her hands up into the air. "She is lying!" Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, desperately looking at Winston and Beatrice for their usual blind support. "Mom, Dad, tell this ugly, bitter loser to stop aggressively lying about my husband. Jamal is a highly successful, wealthy CEO. He would never, ever commit federal financial fraud. He buys me authentic Birkin bags and books, luxury vacations to the Maldives. A fake, struggling businessman could never afford to give me the incredible, wealthy lifestyle I absolutely deserve." Jamal violently snapped his head toward Chloe. The sheer blinding panic and absolute paralyzing fear of impending federal prison time completely overrode his desperate need to maintain his fake wealthy marriage. The charming, charismatic husband facade completely shattered, instantly replaced by a desperate, cornered rat willing to violently sacrifice anyone to save his own skin. "It was all for you, you greedy, demanding, completely insatiable parasite!" Jamal screamed violently at Chloe, his face contorting into an incredibly ugly, vicious mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He aggressively pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly at his shocked wife. "I explicitly told you the business was actively struggling 2 years ago. I desperately begged you to dramatically cut back on the lavish, over-the-top spending. But you absolutely refused. You aggressively threw massive hysterical tantrums every single time I suggested canceling your stupid, expensive country club memberships or holding off on buying another useless custom-imported Italian sports car." Chloe's jaw dropped wide open in sheer absolute horror. She stared at Jamal as if a massive, terrifying monster had just ripped off its human skin right in front of her. "How dare you!" Chloe shrieked wildly, aggressively stomping her designer heel into the Persian rug. "I am your beautiful, high-status wife. It is your absolute fundamental duty as a black man to aggressively provide for me and elevate my social standing. You explicitly promised me a life of extreme, unimaginable luxury. You literally forced me to aggressively cook the corporate books." Jamal roared back, his voice cracking violently with sheer, unadulterated panic. "You relentlessly demanded a new massive mansion in the hills. You aggressively forced me to throw that completely fake multi-million-dollar anniversary gala just to impress your stupid, shallow friends. You explicitly threatened to divorce me and humiliate me in front of the entire church congregation if I did not instantly provide the massive liquid cash you demanded. I had to aggressively defraud my private investors just to keep you from destroying my entire life." The explosive, incredibly violent betrayal happened in a fraction of a second. Chloe let out a loud, furious, completely unhinged scream. She aggressively launched herself directly across the living room, her hands formed into vicious, tight claws. She swung her arm wildly and slapped Jamal directly across his sweating face with a loud, incredibly sharp crack. The sheer, sudden violence of the slap violently echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Jamal stumbled sideways, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, looking absolutely stunned that the beautiful, delicate golden child had just physically assaulted him in front of a billionaire. Beatrice and Winston did not move to aggressively intervene. They did not try to forcefully separate their favorite highly successful daughter from her wealthy, powerful husband. They simply stood frozen near the antique console table, their eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as they finally realized the absolute catastrophic reality of the situation. Their golden son-in-law, was a massive, highly illegal fraud. Their beautiful, successful daughter was a deeply greedy, demanding accomplice, and they were heavily legally tied to him financially. They had aggressively put up the official deed to their sprawling suburban home as the primary collateral for Jamal's massive, highly illegal $80,000 predatory loan 4 years ago. They had actively, knowingly tied their entire financial future to a man who was now facing massive multiple federal indictments. If Jamal's fraudulent empire completely collapsed today, their entire carefully crafted, heavily manufactured life of fake wealth and high social status would be instantly violently destroyed. Beatrice's legs suddenly gave out. She violently collapsed onto the plush Persian rug, landing heavily on her knees. She aggressively clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate, frantic prayer, looking directly up at me with tears streaming down her heavily contoured face. Winston instantly dropped down right beside her, his massive, imposing frame completely crumbling into a pathetic, groveling mess. The aggressive, tyrannical patriarch who had just violently threatened to physically strike me down mere minutes ago was now desperately kneeling on the floor, begging for his financial life. "Naomi, please!" Beatrice wailed loudly, her voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We share the exact same blood. You absolutely cannot send your own flesh and blood to federal prison." Winston aggressively reached out desperately, trying to grab the hem of my simple, comfortable lounge pants. "Naomi, listen to me, daughter," Winston pleaded frantically, his voice shaking with absolute terror. "We made some terrible, heavily misguided mistakes in the past, but we can fix this. We can keep this entirely within the family. Just quietly shred that massive red-stamped audit report. Erase the digital files from Calvin's servers. We will aggressively force Jamal to quietly pay back the investors over time. You are a brilliant, highly skilled auditor, Naomi. You can easily hide the missing money. Please, daughter, you must protect our family's legacy." I looked down at my parents kneeling desperately on the floor, aggressively begging me to actively commit massive federal corporate fraud, just to save their deeply fake, entirely manufactured reputation. They were completely willing to demand that I risk going to federal prison, entirely destroying my pristine professional career and my newborn daughter's future, just so Chloe could keep her imported designer bags and Beatrice could maintain her fake elevated status on the church board. They were truly, absolutely incapable of feeling a single ounce of genuine shame or remorse. "You want me to shred the audit report?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Yes!" Beatrice shrieked instantly, her voice echoing wildly off the high vaulted ceilings. She violently scrambled forward on her hands and knees, desperately clawing at the expensive fabric of my lounge pants. "Yes, Naomi, you must completely destroy that heavy binder. You must absolutely wipe every single digital server at Sterling Holdings entirely clean. You are a brilliant high-level executive now. You can easily make this massive, unfortunate problem completely disappear. We are your blood. You must protect us." Winston eagerly nodded his large head, his former tyrannical pride completely evaporated into thin air. "We can fix this quietly, daughter," Winston pleaded, his voice shaking with raw, unfiltered terror. "We can handle this massive financial discrepancy internally, exactly as a strong, unified family should. Jamal will quietly pay back every single stolen dollar over the next decade. We will keep everything entirely under the radar to aggressively protect our pristine, highly respected reputation in the church community." I looked down at the two of them, my expression completely unchanged. I did not move to pick up the heavy red-stamped binder resting on the glass coffee table. I did not offer a single word of comfort or compliance. Suddenly, a horrifying, catastrophic realization violently struck Beatrice. Her desperate, tear-filled eyes snapped away from my face and locked directly onto Winston. The color drained completely from her heavily contoured cheeks, leaving her looking physically ill and deeply panicked. "Winston!" Beatrice gasped, her voice dropping into a harsh, terrified whisper that carried across the quiet room. "The primary retirement accounts, the highly specialized church annuity funds we privately manage. Tell me you did not actually give Jamal the direct access codes. Tell me you did not maliciously leverage our secure liquid assets to secretly fund his fake luxury expansion." Winston's heavy silence was absolutely deafening, He swallowed hard, nervously avoiding his wife's piercing, terrified gaze. He looked down at the Persian rug, his massive shoulders slumping in utter, undeniable defeat. Beatrice unleashed a loud, guttural, completely unhinged scream. She violently launched herself at her husband, aggressively pounding her manicured fists against his broad chest. "You absolute arrogant fool!" Beatrice shrieked at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her refined, elegant church lady persona. "You aggressively handed that pathetic lying criminal our entire life savings. You actively allowed him to completely drain our secure retirement portfolio. We are entirely permanently ruined." Winston violently shoved Beatrice away, his own blinding panic rapidly morphing into vicious defensive rage. "Do not dare try to blame this catastrophic failure entirely on me, Beatrice," Winston roared back, pointing a heavy, shaking finger directly at his wife's face. "You are the exact one who relentlessly spoiled Chloe since the day she was born. You aggressively demanded that she maintain a flawless high society image at all costs. You actively pressured Jamal to constantly buy her those ridiculous overpriced designer bags and fund those entirely fake luxury vacations just so you could aggressively brag to the church board. You created this greedy, insatiable monster, and Jamal had to aggressively steal just to keep up with your toxic, endless demands." Chloe let out a loud, highly offended gasp from the velvet armchair. "How dare you blame me for his massive illegal failures?" Chloe screamed aggressively, throwing her hands into the air. "I am a high-status wife. I explicitly deserved a life of extreme, unimaginable luxury. Jamal completely lied to me about his actual wealth. He is a pathetic, broke fraud who completely ruined my pristine social standing." Jamal violently turned on Chloe, his face twisted in pure, unfiltered hatred. "I aggressively ruined your standing. You were absolutely nothing before you met me," Jamal yelled, stepping aggressively toward his wife. "You aggressively threatened to divorce me and publicly humiliate me if I did not instantly buy you that massive mansion in the hills. You actively forced me to run a highly illegal Ponzi scheme just to fund your fake, incredibly shallow existence." The entire grand living room devolved into a spectacular, utterly vicious war zone. The carefully constructed, highly manufactured facade of Black family excellence and wealthy religious respectability completely imploded in a matter of seconds. They aggressively tore into each other like a pack of starving feral animals. They violently screamed, aggressively pointed fingers, and maliciously exposed every single toxic, hidden resentment they had harbored for decades. They completely abandoned any pretense of familial love, actively throwing each other directly under the bus in a desperate, frantic attempt to save their own skin. I stood perfectly still, securely holding my peacefully sleeping newborn daughter against my chest. I watched them violently tear each other apart completely and utterly unbothered by the absolute chaos raging around me. For my entire life, I had been the designated scapegoat, the quiet, compliant punching bag they actively used to aggressively bind their toxic family unit together. Without me willingly absorbing their relentless abuse, they instantly turned their lethal venom on each other. It was a beautiful, deeply satisfying, entirely poetic justice. Calvin stepped quietly to my side, his tall, imposing frame a solid wall of absolute protection. He gently placed his strong hand on my lower back, his dark eyes watching the spectacular implosion with cold, clinical detachment. He did not intervene. He did not ask them to lower their voices. He simply allowed the violent, toxic fire to completely burn itself out inside his pristine home. Winston, realizing that aggressively arguing with Beatrice and Jamal was completely useless, suddenly turned his desperate, frantic attention back to me. He violently pushed past his hysterical wife and aggressively threw himself onto his knees right in front of me again, his expensive suit pants wrinkling against the rug. "Naomi, please." Winston begged, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. He aggressively clasped his large hands together, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You have to make this massive nightmare completely go away. You hold all the absolute power here. If you aggressively squash this forensic audit, I swear before God, everything will completely change today." Winston rapidly launched into the most pathetic, highly desperate groveling I had ever witnessed in my entire life. "We will finally treat you with the absolute, unquestioning respect you truly deserve." We will officially make you the ultimate golden child of this entire family. We will aggressively strip Chloe of her status and publicly place you on the highest possible pedestal. I will personally ensure you are given the absolute highest seat of honor at the church board table. You will be the powerful, highly respected matriarch of our entire legacy. Just please, daughter. I am aggressively begging you save us from this complete catastrophic destruction. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life violently tearing down my self-esteem, aggressively mocking my natural appearance, and ruthlessly draining my hard-earned college funds, just to elevate his spoiled, entitled youngest daughter. I was actively offering me the very things I had desperately, painfully craved as a lonely, isolated teenager. He was offering me respect, validation, and a prominent place within the family structure. He truly, honestly believed that his cheap, entirely conditional promises of fake social status would be enough to suddenly buy my absolute loyalty. I slowly bent my knees, lowering my body until I was directly at Winston's eye level. I maintained a perfectly calm, incredibly lethal expression, refusing to show even a single fraction of an inch of mercy or compassion. I do not want a seat at your table, Winston. I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute, terrifying finality. Your entire table is built on rotting, termite-infested wood. Winston's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the true, devastating meaning of my words finally began to sink into his panicked brain. Beatrice violently stopped her hysterical sobbing, freezing completely on the Persian rug. Chloe and Jamal abruptly halted their vicious screaming match, turning their terrified attention toward me. You honestly believed I invited you into my home today to simply reject a pathetic commercial loan application? I asked, a dark, freezing smile slowly spreading across my face. You aggressively assumed I was just holding on to this massive red-stamped forensic audit to maliciously taunt you and force you to beg for my forgiveness. I slowly stood back up, adjusting my hold on my sleeping baby. I looked at the four terrified, completely broken faces staring up at me. I am a senior forensic auditor for a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, I stated smoothly, officially delivering the final, absolutely fatal blow to their entire existence. When I uncover massive multi-million-dollar federal financial fraud, aggressive wire fraud, and highly illegal money laundering schemes, I do not just quietly shred the paperwork to protect corrupt, abusive relatives. I follow strict, undeniable federal protocols. Jamal let out a loud, high-pitched, completely breathless gasp, his hands violently grabbing his own head. I did not just actively reject your fraudulent loan application today, Jamal. I continued, making sure every single word landed with maximum explosive destruction. I explicitly finalized the entire unredacted forensic audit report early yesterday morning. And 24 hours ago, I officially submitted the entire highly detailed criminal file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. The room went completely, utterly, violently silent. The sheer absolute magnitude of my statement hit the four of them like a massive, unstoppable freight train. They were not just facing total financial ruin or public social embarrassment. They were actively facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I had not just closed the door on their wealth. I had explicitly, deliberately locked them inside a burning building and handed the only key directly over to the federal government. Your heavily encrypted offshore accounts have already been fully flagged and aggressively frozen by federal authorities, I added, driving the final lethal nail completely into their coffin. The commercial bank has been fully notified of the massive identity theft regarding the $80,000 loan. Your entire carefully constructed, heavily fabricated reality is completely over. Jamal's eyes darted wildly around the expansive living room. The blinding, utterly suffocating reality of impending federal prison time completely overwhelmed his frantic, cowardly brain. The desperate, fawning salesman persona evaporated, instantly replaced by the raw, animalistic panic of a trapped, terrified criminal realizing his absolute doom was unavoidable. He looked at Calvin's imposing frame, then at the thick, unyielding glass windows overlooking the estate grounds. Jamal let out a strange, high-pitched, terrified squeak. He aggressively spun around, entirely abandoning his weeping wife, his groveling in-laws, and his fake corporate empire. He violently scrambled toward the heavy custom-built front doors of the grand foyer, his expensive leather shoes slipping and sliding aggressively against the polished marble floor. He was making a frantic, completely desperate run for absolute freedom, wildly hoping he could somehow escape the estate before the terrifying reality of his crimes physically caught up to him. He aggressively reached his trembling, sweating hand out, desperately trying to grasp the heavy brass doorknob to throw himself out into the cool evening air. Before his sweating fingers could even brush against the cold metal, a sudden, bright, violently flashing light aggressively pierced through the sheer curtain panels covering the massive living room windows. The intense, rapidly strobing red and blue lights of multiple heavily armored federal vehicles violently illuminated the dark, expansive room, casting long, terrifying shadows directly across Jamal's panicked, frozen face. The heavy, authoritative pounding on the solid mahogany front door echoed like a rapid series of cannon shots through the silent foyer. Jamal violently recoiled from the brass doorknob, stumbling backward until his spine hit the edge of the antique console table. His chest heaved with frantic, shallow gasps. The blinding red and blue strobe lights painted his sweating, terrified face in harsh, alternating colors. Federal Bureau of Investigation. A commanding voice roared from the other side of the thick wood. Open the door immediately, or we will breach the entrance. Winston let out a strange, high-pitched whimper, completely shrinking back against the velvet sofa. Beatrice violently clamped her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes tightly as if denying the physical reality of the situation would somehow make the federal agents magically disappear. Chloe stood completely frozen, her jaw hanging slack as she stared at the flashing lights illuminating her designer sequined dress. Calvin did not rush. He did not show a single ounce of panic or concern. He calmly adjusted his suit jacket, walked past the four terrified intruders, and moved directly toward the grand entryway. He reached out with a steady hand and turned the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the massive double doors wide open. A heavily armed tactical team of federal agents immediately swarmed into the pristine foyer. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, their dark tactical gear striking a sharp, violent contrast against the luxurious imported marble floors. Jamal Washington, the lead agent, shouted, stepping forward with his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. You are officially under arrest for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal money laundering. Get down on the ground right now. Jamal did not attempt to run. His legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the marble floor, sobbing loudly and hysterically like a terrified child. Two federal agents immediately grabbed his arms, forcefully twisting them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the grand living room, sealing Jamal's absolute, undeniable doom. They hauled him violently to his feet, holding him in a tight, inescapable grip. Chloe suddenly snapped out of her shocked paralysis. Seeing her wealthy, high-status husband violently dragged up from the floor completely shattered her fragile, highly manufactured reality. She aggressively lunged forward, her high heels slipping wildly on the Persian rug. "Get your hands off my husband!" Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs, launching herself toward the federal agents. "You cannot do this to us. We are highly respected, wealthy members of elite society. You are completely ruining my expensive rug. Do you have any idea who we actually are?" A stern female agent quickly stepped forward, effortlessly blocking Chloe's frantic, hysterical path. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped legal document, shoving it directly toward Chloe's chest. "We know exactly who you are, Mrs. Washington," the female agent stated with cold, clinical detachment. "We also know exactly how you illegally funded your lifestyle. I am serving you with a federal asset seizure warrant. Every single bank account tied to your husband's fraudulent auto showrooms was officially frozen 24 hours ago. Furthermore, the brand new custom-imported luxury SUV you parked directly outside these gates is currently being impounded as physical evidence of massive wire fraud." Chloe stared blankly at the federal warrant. The words actively failed to process in her greedy, shallow brain. "What do you mean my SUV is being impounded?" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, deafening pitch. "You absolutely cannot take my vehicle. I am a high society wife. I explicitly need that luxury car to attend my exclusive country club luncheons. How am I supposed to maintain my pristine social standing without my custom vehicle? You cannot leave me stranded like a common street beggar. The female agent did not even blink. That vehicle was purchased using highly illegal stolen investor funds, ma'am. It does not belong to you. In fact, nothing you currently own belongs to you. Your primary residence, your designer jewelry, and your personal assets are all subject to immediate federal seizure. I highly suggest you step back and remain completely silent before we decide to aggressively look into your direct complicity in your husband's massive financial crimes. Chloe let out a loud, terrifying wail of pure, unadulterated devastation. She violently threw herself onto the floor, aggressively pounding her manicured fists against the marble tiles. She threw a massive, humiliating, completely hysterical tantrum, screaming wildly about her ruined reputation, her stolen designer bags, and her entirely fake, shattered life. She kicked her feet in the air, ruining her expensive dress, crying ugly, heavy tears of pure selfishness. She did not cry for her husband facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. She cried exclusively for her lost, unearned wealth. Beatrice watched her golden, perfect daughter sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, her mind completely snapping under the immense crushing weight of their total destruction. The fake wealthy church matriarch persona was completely gone. The reality that her entire family was currently bankrupt, socially ruined, and legally targeted hit her with the force of a wrecking ball. Beatrice violently scrambled across the living room floor on her hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human dignity. She crawled frantically toward where I stood, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She aggressively grabbed the hem of my comfortable lounge pants, her heavily ringed fingers gripping the fabric with desperate, terrifying strength. Naomi Beatrice wailed, looking up at me with a face entirely smeared with ruined, expensive makeup. Naomi, I am actively begging you. Please, my beautiful, successful daughter, you have to save us from this absolute catastrophe. I looked down at her, my expression completely blank, devoid of any mercy or compassion. You are incredibly wealthy now, Beatrice frantically pleaded, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You are the senior director of a multi-billion-dollar firm. You are marrying a massive billionaire. You have more liquid cash than this entire family combined. You have to write us a massive check right this second. We desperately need to hire a top-tier elite criminal defense attorney for Jamal to keep him out of federal prison. We urgently need you to instantly pay off our entire defaulted mortgage, so the bank does not violently throw your own father and me out onto the cold streets. Winston desperately crawled forward to join his wife, his massive frame shaking with absolute terror. Yes, Naomi, Winston begged, tears actually streaming down his thick cheeks. We are entirely ruined. The church board will violently strip us of all our prestigious titles. Our wealthy friends will completely shun us. We will have absolutely nothing left. You have to aggressively bail us out. We will do whatever you want. We will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire church congregation. We will officially crown you the absolute head of this family. Just please, write the check and save our home. I stared down at the two people who had actively spent my entire life violently tearing down my self-esteem, aggressively exploiting my hard-earned money, and treating me like an ugly, completely disposable burden. I remembered the sheer, freezing terror of going into premature labor at Jamal's lavish anniversary gala. I remembered the agonizing pain shooting through my spine, the blood soaking through my dress, and the utter absolute rejection when I desperately begged my own mother for a ride to the hospital. You want me to save your home? I asked, my voice deadly calm and chillingly smooth. You want me to financially protect you from the harsh, brutal reality of the streets? Yes, Beatrice and Winston shouted simultaneously, their eyes wide with frantic, desperate hope. I slowly reached my right hand into the deep pocket of my lounge pants. I did not pull out a custom platinum checkbook. I did not pull out a high-limit corporate credit card. My fingers brushed against a small, highly crumpled piece of paper that I had deliberately kept with me every single day since I was violently discharged from the hospital. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. I held up a single heavily wrinkled blood-stained $50 bill. Winston's eyes widened in sheer sudden recognition. The frantic hope instantly vanished from Beatrice's heavily tear-stained face, replaced by a cold, sickening horror as she recognized the exact pathetic denomination. This is the exact $50 bill you aggressively threw at my face while I was bleeding out on the floor of your golden son-in-law's fake lavish anniversary gala, I stated, making sure the entire room heard every single devastating word. When my water violently broke when I was in agonizing, terrifying pain and desperately begging for my mother to simply help me get to an emergency room to save my innocent baby's life, you aggressively told me to use the back alleyway so I would not ruin your expensive imported Persian rug. I stepped closer, towering directly over them as they groveled on the floor. You aggressively shoved this pathetic piece of paper into my hand and explicitly told me to leave quietly, so I would not interrupt Chloe's self-centered, glamorous speech. I continued, my voice dripping with absolute freezing contempt. You actively chose to abandon me and your unborn grandchild to potentially die in a cold, dark street just to protect your fake, shallow social image. I slowly opened my fingers. The crumpled, blood-stained $50 bill fluttered down through the air, landing softly on the floor directly between Beatrice and Winston's trembling hands. Here I said, delivering the ultimate, final, absolute death blow to their entire parasitic existence. This is my one and only financial contribution to this family. Call an Uber. Beatrice let out a loud, devastated wail, completely collapsing onto the floor in utter, absolute ruin. Winston buried his face in his large, shaking hands, letting out a heavy, broken sob of pure, inescapable defeat. They had aggressively gambled their entire lives on a shiny, fraudulent illusion, and they had violently lost absolutely everything. Take him out, the lead federal agent ordered, nodding toward the front doors. The agents aggressively dragged Jamal forward. He stumbled blindly past me in his expensive custom-tailored suit, his wrists tightly bound in heavy steel handcuffs. He was weeping loudly, completely stripped of his arrogant high society facade, looking like nothing more than a pathetic, broken criminal heading straight to a cold federal cell. Calvin signaled to his own massive, highly trained private security team, standing quietly by the front entrance. Escort these three individuals off my private property immediately. Calvin commanded, his deep voice leaving zero room for negotiation. If they attempt to resist or ever return to this address, forcefully restrain them and press immediate trespassing charges. The private security guards stepped forward, their imposing frames towering over my broken family. They aggressively hauled Winston up by his arms, forcing the defeated patriarch onto his trembling feet. They grabbed Beatrice by the elbows, lifting her up as she continued to hysterically sob and hyperventilate. They dragged Chloe up from the marble floor, her expensive sequined dress ruined, her fake wealthy life completely shattered. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand foyer, securely holding my sleeping daughter against my chest, and watched them being violently, forcefully escorted out into the cold, dark night. They stumbled awkwardly down the grand stone steps, aggressively shoved forward by the security team. They had absolutely no luxury cars waiting for them. They had no wealthy friends rushing to their aid. They had nothing but the harsh, brutal reality of massive federal indictments, crippling debt, and public total humiliation. I stepped forward to the massive, heavy mahogany double doors. Winston, Beatrice, and Chloe turned around one last time, looking back at the warm, glowing light spilling out from the beautiful estate. They looked at me, their faces twisted in absolute, permanent devastation. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of farewell. I simply placed my hand firmly on the thick brass handle and forcefully pulled the heavy door shut. The loud, solid click of the massive deadbolt locking into place echoed firmly through the silent foyer, completely, irrevocably locking them out of my life forever. I turned away from the heavy mahogany door, taking a deep, cleansing breath that filled my lungs with pure, unfiltered freedom. For the first time in 32 years, the suffocating heavy weight of my family's toxic expectations was completely gone. Calvin walked over, gently wrapping his strong arms around my waist from behind. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking down at our beautiful sleeping daughter. We stood there in the quiet foyer, surrounded by peace, safety, and an unbreakable bond that no amount of fake, superficial social climbing could ever destroy. 6 months later, the absolute catastrophic reality of my family's downfall was officially cemented into public record. Jamal Washington did not get the highly publicized, high-profile legal defense he desperately screamed for. Without access to any stolen funds, he was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who strongly advised him to take a plea deal. Jamal pleaded guilty to massive wire fraud, federal money laundering, and operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant, flashy businessman who used to aggressively look down on me for working an honest job is now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, scrubbing cafeteria floors for pennies an hour. Chloe's spectacular fall from grace was arguably the most deeply satisfying poetry of all. The federal government aggressively seized absolutely everything she owned: her custom imported luxury SUV, her massive collection of authentic designer handbags, her expensive diamond jewelry, and her frozen bank accounts were all completely confiscated to partially pay back Jamal's furious, defrauded investors. Stripped entirely of her fake manufactured wealth, Chloe was violently thrust into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. My golden child sister, who had spent her entire life aggressively looking down her perfectly contoured nose at working-class people, is now officially working a minimum-wage retail job at a discount shoe store in a dead-end strip mall. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard she constantly complains to anyone who will listen about how her feet hurt, how the customers do not respect her, and how she explicitly deserves a life of extreme luxury. Her retail manager, completely unimpressed by her former high society status, frequently reprimands her for taking unauthorized breaks. She is trapped in a miserable, exhausting cycle of hard labor, completely invisible to the wealthy socialites she used to desperately call her best friends. Winston and Beatrice suffered a social and financial destruction so absolute it became a heavily whispered cautionary tale throughout the entire local community. The sheer magnitude of Jamal's federal indictment instantly dragged my parents' pristine, highly manufactured reputation directly through the mud. When the elite board of elders at their exclusive megachurch officially discovered that Winston had recklessly gambled away the church's specialized annuity funds to secretly finance Jamal's fraudulent luxury expansion, the backlash was swift and merciless. Winston and Beatrice were violently stripped of their prestigious, highly coveted church titles. They were publicly voted off the board in absolute disgrace. The wealthy elite congregation members they had spent decades aggressively manipulating completely shunned them. When they attempted to attend a Sunday service, holding their heads high, the ushers quietly but firmly escorted them out the back doors, explicitly telling them their presence was a massive, highly toxic distraction to the ministry. Financially, I did exactly what I promised. I legally foreclosed on their sprawling suburban home. I did not show a single ounce of hesitation or mercy when the county sheriff arrived to officially enforce the eviction notice. Winston and Beatrice were forcefully removed from the massive house they had used to aggressively project their fake superiority. They now live in a cramped, heavily outdated one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the city. They are completely drowning in the massive, inescapable debt that I successfully collected on. They have no luxury cars, no country club memberships, and absolutely no golden child to proudly flaunt. They have nothing but four narrow walls and the bitter, suffocating reality of their own devastating choices. As for me, my life took a completely different, incredibly beautiful trajectory. I am standing on the sprawling glass-enclosed balcony of Calvin's luxury penthouse, watching the golden hour sun dip below the city skyline. The cool evening breeze gently rustles my natural hair. I am securely holding my healthy, thriving baby girl, listening to her soft, happy coos as she reaches up to grab my necklace. Following the massive success of the forensic audit that completely dismantled Jamal's criminal empire, Sterling Holdings officially promoted me. I am no longer just a senior auditor. I am now the chief financial officer of the entire multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I sit at the head of the corporate table, commanding absolute respect, actively making decisions that shape massive global markets. I built my career on undeniable hard-earned merit, totally free from the toxic transactional strings my family always tried to aggressively attach to success. Calvin steps out onto the balcony holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. He hands me a glass, his dark, handsome face breaking into a warm, incredibly loving smile. He wraps his strong protective arm around my shoulders, pulling me and our daughter close against his side. He kisses the top of my head, looking out at the sprawling, wealthy city we actively conquer together every single day. I lean my head against his chest, looking down at my beautiful, innocent daughter. I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I used to beg for a place in a family that only saw me as a convenient, disposable stepping stone. I say quietly, my voice steady and filled with hard-earned wisdom. I used to desperately crave the conditional toxic approval of people who would have gladly watched me bleed out in a freezing alleyway just to protect their fake, shallow reputation. I look up into Calvin's eyes, seeing nothing but pure, unconditional love and absolute, unwavering support. But I learned the hard way. I continue, a genuine, beautiful smile spreading across my face. Family isn't determined by blood. It's determined by who holds your hand when you have absolutely nothing and who stands right beside you when you build your empire. I raise my glass, clinking it gently against Calvin's. The sound rings out bright and clear in the cool evening air. I am completely independent, incredibly wealthy, and deeply truly loved. It is the ultimate, sweetest vindication I could have ever asked for.